On a beautiful early afternoon, everyone watched Prince Silas and Lady Grace with joy and admiration. They saw that young people really approached each other, and sometimes it seemed to everyone that they were like the main characters, a beautiful picture. At the same moment, the ladies began to whisper about the former wife of the prince, Lady Rafilia, who did not have abilities, while everyone knew that she had disappeared without a trace. There were rumors that she had a second man. Everyone knew that 3 years had passed since the moment of her disappearance, and soon the divorce would be considered complete. They knew that there was about 6 months left, and then the prince would marry Lady Grace again. They understood that it would be better for him, while the young lady, secretly looking at them, felt joy as she saw that they were happy. She knew very well that the mistake of her first life would never happen again. But after a moment, she turned her gaze away and all her thoughts flew away, as her little son asked with amazement who that beautiful young man was. Rafilia, with a smile, told her baby that he saw the prince today. She smiled and said that he is a man who will soon become the next king. The boy was very surprised, and at the same time amazed by his mother's words, because for him it was nothing more than a fairy tale. Rafilia was glad that the young man was alive and well, and at the same time, he reunited with his beloved. She was sincerely glad, since nothing like this had happened in her past life. That's exactly what she thought. But after some time, a young prince appeared on her doorstep and announced that he had been looking for her for a long time. Rafilia, in turn, froze in shock, as she did not expect anything like this. For some time she stared at the spouse in a stupor, but after a moment she was taken aback and said that he had given the wrong address. She was shocked and did not understand why he had come to her. Her first life was completely unhappy, despite the beautiful marriage. Since she was treated coldly due to the fact that she did not have abilities, she spent her days alone. Unfortunately, her husband also ignored her. Rafilia, in turn, felt pain, as she lived a gloomy family life with her husband, who had a beautiful mistress. And then the irreparable happened when she was told that her husband was ill. She ran to him in the tower with all her legs. They shouted at her to stop, as she was not allowed to enter such a place. But she did not listen to anyone. Entering the room of the tower, she froze in the doorway, as she saw her husband, who was lying on the bed, and at the same time he did not show signs of life. Rafilia, in turn, saw a young, beautiful lady who was bursting with bitter tears and calling for the prince. After a moment, they were all informed that the prince had died. Some time later, the doctor reported the results of the autopsy and that toxic components from the herb called bellamist were found. At the same moment, all those present looked intently and menacingly at the prince's consort. The queen could not stand it and shouted that it was the work of Rafilia, who was well versed in different plants. The queen was furious and shouted that the girl was responsible for the death of her husband, and she was sure of it. The young lady was startled and at the same moment shouted that she had not done anything like that. She shouted to the queen that she had made a mistake. But at the same time, the young lady felt her speech, as she understood that no one near her would help her in this situation. In the end, she was framed, accused of a crime, and executed. But approaching the gallows, she still wondered what her life was for at all. Rafilia just wanted to open a pharmacy, which she dreamed of in a small town, but she was accused of such a thing. It was not destined to come true. She sincerely wanted to live in such a way as to be useful to someone. Rafilia, in turn, understood that, if she were born again, she would live the gifted life in a different way, because she always wanted to be a free person and true to herself. After some time, the young lady opened her eyes and saw her husband. She looked at him in bewilderment as she knew what had really happened. But at the same moment, the priest declared them husband and wife. She looked at her husband with bewilderment, as if enchanted, because she understood that she had died earlier. But in turn, she recognized this scene from her past life. She realized that for some reason she returned several years ago, when they were still alive. The young lady was immersed in her thoughts, but at the same time, she was holding meetings for the first wedding night. At the same time, she noticed that the events developed according to the same scenario as before. The young man looked intently at his wife and declared that they only had a fictitious marriage. She sighed heavily, as she had already heard similar words. She knew that soon he would be cold, look at her, and continue talking. Silas looked at her intently and spoke of the reason they had exchanged vows. This was because he wanted the Liddell family to maintain ties with other countries. At the same moment, he declared that they did not need joint children. At the same moment, she sighed heavily as she understood that everything was true, and she clearly remembered these words. Silas said that they will sleep together tonight for appearance's sake, but starting tomorrow, they will sleep in different places. But every week, he will come to her. But at the same time, he did not intend to do anything. Rafilia, in turn, perfectly raised why he wanted to do that, because it was all for the ego of his beloved. At the same time, the young lady could not believe that she really returned to the past, where she was obedient and restrained. She returned to family life, where there was nothing interesting. The prince looked at her in surprise and asked if she had listened to him. He was waiting for her to answer. Rafilia. At the same moment, she realized that if she had spent time going back several years, she should use it to her advantage. She intended to prevent the murder of the prince, later to divorce him, so that no one would die, and the young people would be able to be happy with each other. At the same time, she understood that she could soon leave him and go to fulfill her cherished dream, Rafilia. At the same moment, she happily declared that she understands and accepts everything. She understood that soon her plan would come true. After some time, the young lady was looking for information about bellamist, since this particular herb was the cause of the prince's death. She had heard this name earlier, as she was a fan of medicinal herbs and often read the Encyclopedia of Plants. She understood that for this reason, the queen suspected her. She was born into a family of large merchants and grew up surrounded by rare medicinal herbs. She very much liked to find flowers and plants, walking along the streets and fields. Moments later, the young lady found information about the herb. But she also found information about bellamist from the same family. It had similar toxic components, but only a small part. Studying books, she realized that this is not poison at all, but a medicine that can be used to recover from fatigue. Taking similar medicines, you can calm down sleep, and at the same time, the medicine had a relaxing effect. Rafilia, in turn, noted that in this case the immune system will be stimulated, but there is a possibility that antibodies against the drug will be produced in the body. After a moment, she threw all her thoughts away as she heard someone knock on her door. At the same moment, the maids entered her room and announced that the prince would not be able to join her for dinner and on official business. Rafilia looked at the maids with a smile and said that she understood everything. At the same time, she thanked them and asked if they could bring dinner to her room. At the very beginning, he came to her and talked about everything himself, but in the end, he stopped doing this. Apart from official events, she always ate alone. After some time, the young lady finished her reading and decided to take a walk, as she saw that the weather was beautiful. After a moment, she looked intently out the window and noticed a beautiful landscape. But a few moments later, Ona heard some noise behind her. Rafilia looked intently at the maids, as they were quietly discussing something. She felt the heat of their gazes, which were painful for her. She could hear them all whispering behind her back and discussing the fact that she couldn't use her abilities. She understood that for them, this was a hot topic for discussion, because she, having no abilities, entered the royal family. Her husband was the second, the prince of the kingdom. He was a high-ranking user of abilities, exceptionally talented, and possessed of great power, even among members of the royal family. There were 3 types of people in their country: high-ranking users of abilities, and polzavadali, who do not have abilities. Possessors of abilities are endowed with special powers of the Lord of Birth, and their class is determined by the strength and nature of this ability. In turn, she always wondered if she could get married without any abilities. At first, she hoped that the prince fell in love with her at first sight, or something like that. But after a while, she realized that their marriage was fictitious. His words destroyed her hope, and even in the morning she was not well. But still, the young lady gathered courage and looked closely at her husband, who was quietly sleeping next to her. Rafilia stared at him for some time, because he was handsome. She was embarrassed because his beauty dazzled her. But after a moment, all her thoughts flew away, as the prince, without opening his eyes, coldly asked if she could leave, since she had already woken up. Rafilia, in turn, looked at her husband with indignation, as she did not expect such coldness, but still she understood his reaction. She was puzzled because the prince only wanted to have connections with other families and with other countries, but he did not want to have children. She remembered how her parents said that she did not have abilities, but she married a wonderful man, so she should not argue and should spend time in obedience. They wanted her to know her place and be silent all the time. In turn, the young lady knew very well that she was doing everything her parents asked her to do. But to her disappointment as a result, she never felt love and ended her life in agony and torment after being framed and hanged. Now Rafilia wanted to trust her intuition and do everything for her comfort, but she didn't want to do anything that could hurt her family. After some time, the young lady was startled as she saw the queen and the prince on her way. She froze for a moment as she saw the man who had brought her to death. She remembered how the queen was angry with her, and she expressed her anger in accusations. Rafilia, in turn, understood that everything was in the past, and now she needed to live in the present. She at the same moment bowed and greeted them. The queen looked at the girl with a bright smile and asked who she was. Rafilia, in turn, understood that the queen wanted to strike her, because even despite the fact that the queen was present at the wedding ceremony, she said the same thing. In the past, the queen's words hurt her, but now she proudly introduced herself and announced that she had become the prince's wife yesterday. She told the queen with a smile that, although she was inexperienced, she would like her to take care of her queen, and at the same time mockingly asked the girl's forgiveness. The queen at the same moment mockingly used her power and declared that, as an apology, she would like to present her with a small gift. Rafilia looked at the queen in surprise as she used her abilities. A moment later, the girl had flowers in her hands. As she was leaving, the queen mockingly told the young lady that these flowers suited her very well, and at the same time, she wished her a good day. Rafilia saw that the queen was showing off her abilities, and at the same time her son did not even respond to the greeting. She knew that the prince always followed in his mother's footsteps and carried out her every order. A moment later, the young lady went out on the terrace and noticed that the sun was shining very brightly, so she decided that she needed to go back and get the hat. But approaching the door, she froze for a moment, because she heard that the maids were whispering among themselves and asking each other who they would choose as king in the end. They gave their preference to Prince Silas, like all the citizens of the kingdom, because his brother lacked charisma. Rafilia, in turn, sighed heavily, as it was uncomfortable for her to hear such things, and she did not want to enter the room, interrupting their dialogue. But after a moment she was startled and shuddered, as her husband approached her from behind and asked why she was hiding behind the door. She was taken aback and started mumbling something in response. But at the same moment, the young lady froze in place, as she remembered this moment from her past life. In turn, they heard how the maids discussed the succession to the throne, as they knew that the king wanted to change the order of succession to the throne. The king wanted his son Silas to become his successor, and that's why the queen was so annoyed lately. At the same moment, the lady looked askance at her husband, as she knew what would happen next. She remembered how he entered the room and, looking at everyone with a cold look, declared that they did not need people who chatted non-stop, and therefore he dismissed the maids. She was a little puzzled because at that moment she could not say anything, and the maids lost their jobs. For some time she stared intently at the maids, not deciding to do something. At the same moment, the maid told her friend that such a thing was quite natural, since the prince was not a biological son for the queen. At the same moment, Rafilia could not stand it and burst into the room. She shouted and called the maids, while they turned in fright and looked at her with horror. Rafilia looked at them with fury and declared that such rumors were insolent. She declared that they were serving the Supreme Lord, and at the same time, they could not know who could be eavesdropping on them at that moment. Therefore, she asked them not to say anything like that from now on. She shouted that this time she would ignore something like that, but if they do something like that next time, the castle will be abandoned. Rafilia looked menacingly at the maids and asked if they understood her. At the same moment, the maids bowed before the mistress and declared that they understood everything, and this would not happen again. After a moment, the young lady looked after them with a satisfied smile, because thanks to the fact that she scolded them first, they avoided losing their jobs. At the same time, she felt her husband's gaze. In turn, he stared at her for some time, as he did not expect such actions from her at all. After some time, the young lady enjoyed the meal. Rafilia understood, of course, that the taste of the dish was beautiful, but she was still lonely. Rafilia looked closely at the maids, as she knew that since that day they behaved extremely cautiously and restrained. She remembered how she scolded them. At the same time, she really wanted you to be in the castle, whoever it was, with whom she could talk more comfortably. But at the same moment she sighed heavily, as she realized that she did not need such a man, as she would soon leave the castle. Rafilia, in turn, perfectly understood that she needed to correctly draw up a divorce plan. At the same moment, she remembered the events of her past life, since she was kidnapped around this time. She thought for a moment about all the details and remembered that she was kidnapped about 6 months after the wedding. She was safely rescued by her husband's subordinates, but if she uses this commotion as a cover, she may be able to stage a disappearance. Rafilia knew very well that according to the laws of the kingdom, a divorce should be issued 3 years after the disappearance, so she wanted to run away and stay in hiding for 3 whole years. After a moment, the maid served her a beautiful tea. Sipping the tea, the young lady enjoyed every bit of it. She knew that it was a poisonous herb that caused the death of her husband. Therefore, she wanted to prepare tea for him so that he could develop immunity against poison. She knew that her tea would help him and strengthen his immunity to poisons and take away fatigue. Rafilia was a bit puzzled, as she knew where the grass actually grew, and it wasn't a very safe place. For a while, the prince looked at his wife in amazement and asked if she really wanted to go to the quiet forest. She said with a smile that it was so, because it was in the forest that there was a medicinal plant that could only be found there. She wanted to prepare a herbal decoction from it, but she did not manage to arrange it. She heard a firm refusal. Silas declared that the appearance of monsters was recorded in the forest. The young lady, in turn, gave several arguments in her defense. At the same time, she said that she wanted to make tea specifically for him, because he really liked to drink tea. The young people were taken aback for a moment. At the same moment, the young man, with a smile, asked the prince why he would not allow his wife to go to such a place. Lord Owen was the captain of the knights who served the royal family. She looked intently at the young people, as she knew that the knight often visited the prince's room. Unfortunately, she knew what was waiting for all of them in the future, and therefore she lost her mood. The prince looked intently at his wife and said that he was about to start a state meeting, so he could not accompany her. Owen looked intently at everyone present and asked how about Togo acting as her bodyguard. He looked at them with a smile and declared that he was a knight captain after all, so he could accompany the ladies. After some time, the young people went to the forest, while the young man asked his companion if she really likes plants. She said with a smile that she likes them. Rafilia looked intently at her companion, since she had not communicated much with him until now, and she did not know what kind of friendly person he was. After all, in her first life, the young lord died of an epidemic. At first it looks like a mild cold, but as soon as the temperature rises, that's the end. It never goes down. The rash began to spread over the entire body, and by the time the rash covers the entire body, the victim is completely exhausted. Such symptoms eventually led to death. Hundreds of people died before the Lord, but unfortunately, he was also one of them. She understood that if only the medicine had appeared earlier, the Lord would not have suffered so much and would not have died. After a moment, the young man stopped and looked at his companion in surprise, as he saw that she was worried about something. Rafilia. At the same minute, she looked intently at her companion, as she understood what herbs are needed for specific treatment and how to find herbs. She reminded that there were several months before the sad events, and she understood that she had time to prepare the medicine. The Lord looked at the young princess in amazement, as he did not understand why she looked at him in such a way. But after a moment he shuddered as he felt someone's presence. At the same moment, he blocked her with his body and asked for forgiveness, pulled out the sword from its scabbard, and at the same time, he prepared to attack. After a few seconds, they saw a huge monster in front of them. At the same time, the young captain did not lose a single minute, and at the same time, he lost the force. The animal was startled at the same moment, and a moment later ran back into the forest. The Lord asked his companion if she was all right. At the same time, he asked for forgiveness for such a thing, because this was inevitable, but she only thanked him for saving her with a smile. Rafilia gazed at the young man with admiration, as it was the first time she had seen the fiery ability up close. At the same moment, the young man sighed and said that the prince did not show her his magic, because he had a hard time helping her because of the curse and imprisonment. She looked at him in surprise, as she did not understand what he was talking about. At the same moment, the Lord realized that he had made a mistake, because she did not know anything about what had happened, and therefore, apologizing, he asked her to forget what he had said. The young lady, in turn, wanted to ask him what he was talking about, but at the same moment, she was distracted as she saw what she wanted to find earlier. At the same moment, she rushed to the grass she found. The Lord came closer to her and said with a smile that it was wonderful. She smiled and said that now she could easily prepare herbal tea for her husband. The Lord looked at her with a smile, as he realized that his prince was just a lucky man. After some time, the young lady met her husband, and he invited her to the greenhouse. Rafilia asked her husband if they would really drink tea in such a place, but he said that if she didn't want to, then maybe she wouldn't drink tea. Rafilia asked her husband to drink tea together, but she did not expect that he would let her into the greenhouse. In her past life, she could only see the greenhouse from the outside. Silas looked at his wife while sipping tea. He chose a greenhouse because she told him she liked plants, but he didn't think she would be so happy about something like that. After a moment, young Lydia broke their awkward silence and asked how he was doing. He did not answer his wife's question, but said that the tea was really good because it was easy to drink and had a refreshing taste. Rafilia looked at her husband with a satisfied smile because she understood that if he continued to drink tea, he would develop immunity. She sighed heavily as she understood that he really did not intend to have a dialogue with her. She understood that if she had been her old self, she would have remained silent and done everything as her parents told her. But now she was not going to give up so easily. At the same moment, she said that she very much hoped that she would not overdo it. But she had several questions for him, and the prince was surprised by her insistence. Rafilia said she would like to talk to him about water pollution in the western region. The prince looked at her in surprise, as he did not expect her to raise this question. Rafilia stated that she had heard that some of the toxic wastewater from the mine development had not been properly treated and was leaking, and now it was affecting the local water supply. The epidemic first broke out and spread like wildfire in the western region, and she heard that the main cause was largely due to polluted water, so she wanted to prevent it and do everything in her power. She said that she had an interesting question regarding the elimination of the water supply system in various regions, starting with the western region, and she would like to hear how he would solve this problem. At the same moment, the prince looked at his wife with a smile, because he was surprised by her words, because it also worried him, because water is the source of human life, so he thought that they should work out a plan. But still he looked at his wife with surprise, as he saw that she was well informed about this matter. He looked at her menacingly, because it seemed to him that a few days ago she was not bothered by what the maids were saying, as if she already knew about such things. Rafilia sighed and declared that this was not the case, because she simply considered it wrong to repeat rumors that could be false. At the same moment, the prince said that these rumors were true. Sipping tea, the young lady calmly declared that she knew everything and understood perfectly. He looked at her in surprise and knew that the question of the royal succession also concerned her possibility of becoming a queen. He wanted to know if she was not worried about it. She did not worry about this, as she intended to divorce him. But at the same moment, the young lady declared that he did not need to worry, as she prayed only for the well-being of the country. Silas looked at his wife with a note of surprise and said that she had a rather philosophical view of life, and at the same time, he remarked that he had never met a woman like her. Rafilia looked at her husband, as she could not imagine that someday she would have a peaceful conversation with him in the greenhouse, but now she understood that she needed to have a conversation with him. After a moment, the prince stood up from his seat as he heard a familiar voice. Rafilia, in turn, sighed heavily as she understood that it was time to step back, because her beloved wife had come. For some time they stared intently at the suitable Lady Grace. At the same moment, Lady Grace asked for forgiveness for her intrusion with a smile. The prince looked at her in surprise, as he did not expect to see him in such a place. But the lady said that she had a question that she should discuss with him alone. Rafilia looked at the lady with sadness as she entered the greenhouse, as if she were the owner of such a place, but at the same time, she understood that she should have foreseen such a thing. At the same moment, the lady announced that she had come on personal business. The prince asked his companion for forgiveness, and at the same moment, the young people headed for the exit. Rafilia looked at the lady with a smile and said that she had nothing to worry about, and she also wished her a safe journey. She saw in front of her a stunning man and a stunning woman. Looking after them, the young lady understood that they were indeed a beautiful couple. In turn, the young lady continued to drink tea, while she understood that they did not need to worry, because they would not have to hide for a long time, since her plan was to bring them together. After some time, the young lady surprisingly asked her husband if he was sure that it would be acceptable for her to join him. Silas said that it didn't matter, because he didn't want to be asked about something like that again. She, in turn, never dreamed that he would allow her to join him on inspections of the western region, but she noticed that expressing her opinion bore fruit. The prince looked at his wife in surprise and asked what was on her mind, but she only smiled and said that it was nothing. Rafilia, in turn, did not expect that he would resolutely follow her advice, and therefore she was simply satisfied. The prince looked at her in surprise, as he did not expect to hear such a thing. After some time, they arrived at their destination and at the same time inspected the territory. After the inspection, the prince declared that the water was polluted more seriously than he had originally thought, and it not only threatened people's lives, it also threatened lives, livestock, and crops. At the same moment, the prince declared that they would act it without delay. The man thanked the prince with a smile. At the same moment, the man said that they had sent their requests in writing, but they had never imagined that the prince would do them a similar honor and inspect the territory in person. At the same moment, everyone present bowed their heads before the spouses. Rafilia, in turn, felt relieved, as she understood that if they could solve the problem with their water, now they would be able to maintain sanitary standards, even if the epidemic broke out. For a few minutes, she came to the bench to her friend. The man greeted the lady with a smile and thanked her and her husband for listening to their laments earlier. Rafilia said that she should thank them, and therefore she asked for a few minutes of the man's time. At the same minute, she presented a small basket with herbs that had not yet quite entered the wider market, but they possessed powerful antibacterial properties. Rafilia informed the man that the herbs were harmless and had absolutely no side effects, while the may were a little capricious in cultivation, but with proper care they should quickly take root. With a smile, she asked the man to use similar herbs in treatment. He was surprised and shocked because she provided something valuable. At the same moment, the man asked the lady if she was confident in her action. She said with a smile that she was confident. Rafilia said with a smile that they would be invaluable if an unforeseen illness happened. After a moment, she gave him the instructions for preparing the medicine, and at the same moment, she said goodbye to her old friend. Her statement that the herbs are spread abroad was a complete fabrication, but it is a small price to pay if it saves people's lives. She was just lucky that her father imported such herbs. At the same time, her father was furious because she could not calm down after the wedding. She understood everything, but she said that she had done such a thing for the last time. At the same time, she walked with a smile to her husband, who was eagerly waiting for her. She understood that she had done everything in her power. At the same time, she understood that she was obliged to her husband, but after a few moments, all her thoughts fled, as her husband was hit on the head with a stone. Rafilia in the same minute ran to her husband. At the same time, all those present froze in place in shock when they saw that the little boy had thrown a stone at the prince. At the same moment, the men grabbed the little boy and pinned him to the ground. But the boy, in turn, did not stop and shouted that it was all the king's fault. With tears in his eyes, he said that while the royal family was in decline, they ordinary people suffered in poverty. At the same time, they lived between crushing taxes and neglect of the king. To his regret, his mother worked until exhaustion until it killed her. He was furious because later they also took his sister. All those present fell silent, not knowing what they expected to do, what the prince did. At the same moment, the prince slowly approached the boy. Rafilia hoped that her husband would not commit violence against the boy, but the prince only tenderly stroked the boy's head and asked for forgiveness. Silas said that he would see to it that their grievances reached the king, and he would do everything in his power to reform the system. Everyone present froze in place in shock, as they did not expect to hear anything like this. At the same time, the prince's wife stood stunned, not knowing what to do in this situation. Some time later, the young people returned to the castle. Rafilia? Looking at her husband, she wondered if everything was okay with him. She saw that his eyes were burning with anger, but he looked deeply sad. At the same moment, the young lady began to talk about everything that had happened with a smile. But after a moment, she felt an unpleasant feeling, as her husband ignored her. Silas sighed and said that he also lost his mother when he was about the age of a boy. Silas said with sadness in his voice that he knew very well what the boy was going through. Rafilia looked at her husband in bewilderment, as she knew that his biological mother had died of an illness. At the same moment, she fixed her gaze on him and noticed that he still had small pebbles and sand in his hair. Rafilia came closer to her husband and shook the stones from her hair. He did not expect this and at the same moment grabbed her hand. She was startled and embarrassedly asked for forgiveness, but at the same time informed that he had stones in his hair. He looked at her in surprise, as he did not expect such a thing. But a moment later, the young lady quietly sat next to her husband, holding hands. At the same moment, he announced that today is the day of their weekly meeting. She looked at him in surprise, as she had completely forgotten about such a thing. But at the same moment, the prince said that she should wait for him in his room in the evening. As last time, they slept in the same bed. Rafilia, in turn, perfectly understood that it was easier that way. But unfortunately, she forgot her night heating pad, and now it was very difficult for her to fall asleep, as she was a person with poor blood circulation. Silas asked his wife if she really couldn't sleep. She sighed and said that, unfortunately, she couldn't sleep. Then the lady said that this night is very cold, but the prince did not understand whether the night was cold or not, since he had a high body temperature. She said with a smile that she envied him. At the same moment, the young lady moved closer to her husband, and at the same time she lightly touched his leg. He was surprised, as he did not expect such a thing, but at the same moment, she asked if she could borrow his warmth for a short time. Rafilia looked at her husband with an embarrassed smile and said that something like that was nicer than a hot water bottle, and that's why she was happy. He was very embarrassed, but did not know how to answer her. At the same moment, he looked away from her in confusion and declared that she could do as she pleased. Rafilia thanked him for allowing her to accompany him today, because it was a wonderful experience for her. The prince sighed heavily and declared that he was very glad that he was able to see such a place on his own. Silas, looking into the distance, said that this happened only thanks to her proposal, and at the same time, he noted that she was a good catalyst. At the same moment, she stated that the mayor mentioned the direction of the request regarding water supply. She asked her husband if he knew about it. He stated that he did not know about it, and the request was suspended at the ministerial level. Rafilia said, with a smile, that it is necessary to visit similar places and listen to the opinion of ordinary citizens. She said that she meant everyone who was engaged in national affairs, since the issue of supply should have been the responsibility of the minister. Rafilia knew that the same applied to the problem of poverty and decision-making on the national budget, because all decisions were made at the table without a direct inspection of the place. Of course, the king's intention also played a role, but she knew that if everything continued in this spirit, an uprising would break out and the king would eventually strangle himself. Looking at her husband, she said that she saw how he treated the king and ministers after visiting various places. She sighed and said that in the end, everything is decided by the votes of those around the king and queen. Rafilia Zasapaya said that this is incredibly upsetting to her because he worked sincerely and tried, but unfortunately, he could not help ordinary citizens. He looked at her in surprise as she spoke as if she had been watching his work all this time. At the same time, he does not understand why she asked to comfort him. He looked intently at his wife as he remembered the first meeting before the wedding. He remembered what his wife was before their wedding because she always hid in the shadows of her relatives. But now he saw that she had changed very much, and for the better. At the same time, he simply could not tear his gaze away from her. But still a moment later he pulled away from her, and at the same time he was very embarrassed. At the same moment, the prince felt that he was moving away from her completely. But after a moment, he moved closer to her, as he wanted to warm her. The next day, the young lady looked out the window with a smile, as she saw that outside the window was beautiful weather. She understood that she could go out for a short walk, but after a moment, she heard some kind of rumbling outside the door. Going out into the corridor, she froze, because she saw a not very pleasant scene, how the queen mocked the maid. The queen was furious, as she saw that the maid could not cope with even a simple errand. Therefore, in a fit of anger, she fired her and ordered the maid to leave the castle immediately. The maid, standing on her knees, told the queen that she would never make such a mistake again. She begged the queen to leave her at her old place of work, but the queen mockingly declared that she was tired of her lack of charm. The queen said that the girl could easily return to the countryside. Rafilia, in turn, decided to intervene in a small dispute. At the same time, she picked up flowers and asked the queen's forgiveness. At the same moment, she declared that these incidents were orange when they were plucked, but they were rare and became redder over time, and they were probably orange when the maid received them. The queen angrily shouted to the young lady that this was between her and her maid, and she must leave them immediately. Rafilia, in turn, accidentally saw the maid's small medallion and realized that she was that boy's sister. She raised that Lydia lived in the castle to support her younger brother. Rafilia came to the maid's defense and asked the queen if she could not allow her to take the girl as her maid. She bowed low and declared that she had several maids, but that was more than enough for her, and Lydia alone would be enough for her. The queen, in her turn, looked intently at the girls, but at the same moment, she declared that they could do anything they wanted, and she left them. Rafilia looked at the maid with a smile and shouted from behind that she really likes flowers. She asked the maid to decorate her room with them. Lydia was touched by the young lady's words, so she burst into tears and thanked her for such generosity. After some time, a young lady with a happy smile was reading a book in her room. Lydia watched the lady, but still she could not stand it, and asked why she helped her in such a situation. Rafilia, looking at the maid, declared that the queen had acted unwisely, and it was unfair on her part to fire Lydia for such a thing. Lydia was shocked, and she did not expect to hear something similar from the lady, because she thought that the lady was a more restrained person. At the same moment, Lydia announced that she had come to the castle after the death of her mother in the western countryside, and, unfortunately, over time, she had forgotten how to smile properly. Rafilia looked at the girl and understood that she was going through difficult times. Lydia sighed heavily and asked her mistress to be more careful with the queen. Lydia told the lady that she must have heard rumors about the issues of the royal succession, while the queen made many remarks that showed that she thought poorly of Silas and Rafilia. Rafilia, in turn, understood that Prince Silas stood in the way of the queen because she wanted her son to become king. Also, the young lady understood that if she gave birth to an heir, it would bring them closer to the throne. She sighed heavily, as she knew that he had already rejected the idea of having children, and she was perfectly aware of the malice of the queen in relation to her, because in her past life, she exposed her as the poisoner of her own spouse. At the same moment, she was startled and wondered what if the queen had actually poisoned her wife. And later the queen pointed to her as a poisoner, and therefore she was executed. Rafilia, in turn, assumed that all her guesses were true. The next day, a young lady came to her husband and knocked on the door of his office, saying that she had brought tea. She didn't wait for him to answer, so she decided to look into the office. But as soon as she entered, she noticed that her husband was quietly asleep, minding his own business. She wanted him to drink his herbal tea regularly, but since she saw that he was asleep, she decided to leave him a note. At the same minute, she wrote him a small note and thanked him for his hard work, while she asked him to drink tea. Rafilia left a note on the table, but saw documents, namely a plan for the construction of a water supply system for the western region and a proposal for financial reform to combat poverty. Rafilia looked at her husband with a smile, as she understood that he had made a plan for the country they were talking about the other day. At the same minute, she put the documents, and at the same time she realized that he was very tired. But at the same moment the prince woke up. He turned his gaze in my direction and saw his wife, who was very close to him. Silas, surprised and embarrassed, asked his wife what she was doing in his office. At the same moment, she asked for forgiveness and said that she had brought him some tea and thought that she could leave it. At the same time, the young man noticed a small note that she had left earlier. Silas looked at his wife with a smile and thanked her. At the same moment, she declared that she was overstepping the bounds of what was permitted. "But of course, I wanted to ask something." She said with a smile that she used to do accounting in her family, so she would like to help them. But at the same moment, a friend of his entered the prince. Owen greeted the young lady with a joyful smile and asked how she was doing, while the prince looked menacingly at his friend and said that he would not mind knocking. Rafilia looked at the knight with a smile and greeted him, and also thanked him for yesterday. He smiled and said that he did not need to be thanked. He said that their walk was like a date, and they had a great time, so she could contact him at any time. Rafilia thanked him for such words with a smile. At the same moment, the young man said that, apparently, he interrupted their conversation, and therefore they should not pay attention to him, and they could continue the conversation. Rafilia looked at her husband with a smile and said that she would like to help him in any way, and she would be happy if he gave her a simple clerical job. The prince said that there was no need for this, but at the same time the lady insisted on some work. But he turned her away all this time, and at the same time, the young knight watched their verbal altercation. Rafilia, in turn, could not stand it and at the same moment shouted that she was bored and would like to do some business. Owen, with a smile, said that the lady is very nice, and at the same time she was worried about her husband. Looking at her friend, he asked him to give her a job, whatever her job was. Owen, with a smile, told his friend that he constantly complained that he had a lot to do, and for this reason, he did not have time to follow up on everything. At the same moment, the prince gave in and declared that he would allow her to work on something. Lydia, in turn, was very happy with such words. A few minutes later, they saw old documents from the time when the knights went on an expedition to the Black Forest. The prince sighed and said that they had recently said that the funds for the expedition were not enough, so he drew up a report and planned to order the expenses. At the same moment, he looked intently at his friend and declared that it had been his job before. After a moment, the young people turned around because they heard some noise behind them. They looked in amazement at the lady, who without a word got down to work. After only a while, she happily announced that she had finished all the work. At the same time, the young people were very surprised, as they needed more time to finish such a thing. Rafilia looked at them with a smile, and at the same time told about all her innovations that she introduced to improve work. Owen said with a smile that the lady had done a wonderful job, and she even highlighted the problems within the knights, so he expressed his sincere gratitude. At the same moment, the prince told his wife that he was very grateful to her, and he would be glad if she helped him in the future. She happily agreed. At the same moment, the prince looked menacingly at his friend and declared that it was time for him to return to work, as he did not like that his friend was harassing his wife. Silas, looking at his wife, said that he would write an assignment for her, so that he was counting on her from tomorrow. She looked at him with joy as she was ready to work. At the same moment, the lady told her husband that today is the day of their joint night. Leaving, she said with a smile that she would visit him in the evening. The prince, in turn, sighed heavily. After a moment, he again read the small note that his wife had left for him earlier. That same evening, the young lady came to her husband, and they were quietly lying in bed. The prince asked if her feet were cold, but the lady said with a smile that it was not so cold today, so everything was fine with her. Rafilia looking at her husband, she wondered if he was all right. Sighing, the prince declared that everything was fine with him, but at the same moment she touched his leg and realized that his body was frozen. Silas was embarrassed and timidly said that the fireplace was being repaired now, and he might have caught a cold after the bath. Rafilia! Looking at her husband, she wondered what they should do. Embarrassed, the prince asked if she could turn around. The young lady was a little embarrassed by his question, but still did as he wanted. At the same moment, he said that if they stay in a similar position, it will soon heat up. Rafilia was embarrassed by such a situation, but still she decided to turn around, and then their eyes met. After a moment, she saw changes in her husband. But after a few seconds, she asked if everything was okay with him, as she saw that his condition was changing for the worse. At the same moment, the young lady reached out to her husband as she saw that his shoulder was glowing. She did not know whether it was a bruise or something else, because his shoulder shone with a blue-violet light, and she had never seen anything like it before. Rafilia was frightened and asked her husband if everything was all right with him. Silas writhed in pain, said that everything was fine with him. He asked to leave him, and at the same time, he wanted her to leave the room immediately. She was shocked and did not understand how she could leave him in such a state and just walk away. Rafilia was frightened and said that he always overexerted himself when he was alone. She wanted him to rely more on the people around him. At the same moment, the young lady stood up and said that she would call the doctor immediately. The prince did not want her to call someone, and at the same moment he reached for her, but, unfortunately, he did not manage to grab her, and only with the help of his strength dropped the vase with flowers. Rafilia, in turn, looked around in amazement because she did not expect such a thing. At the same moment, the prince declared that there was no need to call a doctor, as it was simply exhaustion. The young lady had a different opinion, but at the same moment a man entered the room and asked the prince what had happened as he heard the noise. Rafilia stared intently at her husband and his subordinate for some time. Because she could not do anything, she was a little excited, as she had never seen the prince in such a state before. For some time, the young lady stared intently at her husband. She knew that they had already slept in the same bed several times. But at the same time, she was a little puzzled, since there was no such thing in her previous life. She thought that, most likely, these were the consequences of her changes. At the same moment, she threw all her thoughts away as the man called her. He looked at the lady with a smile and declared that he would be with the prince so that she could return to her room. Rafilia asked her companion if he was really sure that everything was fine with the prince. He said that everything was fine with the prince, and that was what the prince wanted. After a moment, she left them, but standing outside the door, the young lady wondered if it was really just exhaustion. She understood that he had worked a lot, and he could have had a similar attack. But at the same time, the thought that he might have some chronic disease did not leave her, and she was very worried. Rafilia was immersed in her thoughts and did not notice anyone on her way. Therefore, she accidentally bumped into Lady Grace. At the same moment, Lady Grace asked for forgiveness with a smile, as she did not notice Rafilia and accidentally bumped into her. Rafilia was taken aback, and at the same time declared that it was her fault. Rafilia looked at the lady in bewilderment, as she did not understand where she was going in the middle of the night. But at the same moment, the young lady looked in surprise at Grace, as she entered the room to her husband. She was shocked to realize that the message had been sent, and Lady Grace hurried to the prince. Rafilia understood that the person whom the prince wanted to see next to him in difficult times was still Lady Grace. She pointed out that even if the prince had a chronic disease, he could only tell Grace. She remembered the moment when she said that he should rely more on the people around him. Rafilia, in turn, was a little saddened, but at the same time glad that the prince had a man on whom he could rely. The next day, the young lady and her maid went to the prince, as the lady wanted to visit him. Rafilia thanked her maid with a smile for helping her carry the heavy basket. Lydia said that thanks to this offering, the prince would recover quickly. At the same moment, they opened the door and were taken aback for a moment. To their surprise, the girls saw Lady Grace, who greeted them with a smile, and said that they could go to my room, since the prince was inside. Rafilia greeted the lady with a smile and thanked her for such valuable information. At the same moment, Lydia called her mistress while she was very excited. Lydia looked closely at the mistress and declared that it was too much, and she was right to be angry. Rafilia sighed, as she realized that her maid had heard the rumors that were going around the castle. Lydia was furious because she knew that the prince had relations to marriage, but she thought that everything would end after the wedding. She was furious and, in turn, was trembling with anger. Lydia said with fury that no matter how beloved and respected Saint Lady Grace was by everyone, she should have understood that the prince had a wife, and she should not act in a similar way. Rafilia looked at the maid with a smile, because initially she too was hurt. But in the end, similar feelings turned into disappointment and humility. She understood that the implementation of her plan is now a priority, and she wanted to get a divorce without letting anyone die, so that everyone could find their happiness. She knew that young people would also be happy. After a moment, all her thoughts flew away as she saw her husband, who was interested in what she was doing. Rafilia greeted her husband with a smile and also asked how he was feeling. At the same moment, the prince said that she shouldn't have worried about him so much, since everything is fine with him. Rafilia said, with a smile, that she was glad to hear such a thing, and at the same time she offered him a basket with treats. Silas turned away and asked for forgiveness, said that she and the others could eat the treat. At the same moment, Silas announced that he would be absent from the castle for several days. She barely understood everything, but at the same moment she saw that the prince was shaking. Unfortunately, she dropped a basket of fruit because of the prince, while the prince shouted at his wife not to touch him. She froze for a moment in a stupor, as she did not expect anything like this. At the same time, they looked at the prince in amazement for several minutes, and no one uttered a word. The next day, The young lady quietly stood by the window and read documents. But after a moment, she saw her husband, who was sweetly cooing with Lady Grace. Lydia was furious. At the same time, she was angry with the prince, for he shouted to Rafilia not to touch him, but at the same time, he allowed Lady Grace to touch him. Lydia could not understand how her mistress could look at something like this with icy calmness. Rafilia said that everything was fine, and she was not upset by this person. Rafilia, in turn, clearly remembered how the prince shouted at her and told her not to touch his ego. Rafilia understood that last night they were very close in bed, and everything was fine. But after he got sick, he completely changed. Lydia was puzzled, as she knew that the prince was leaving the castle for a few days, but she could not believe that he had gone with Lady Grace. She assumed that this was some kind of secret trip on a date. Rafilia, with a smile, asked her maid not to joke in such a way. The young lady, in turn, was used to seeing similar scenes. She knew that they periodically left the castle to spend time in such a way. Rafilia assumed that they wanted to appreciate the time spent alone, especially when the prince suffered. But to her relief, the young lady no longer suffered from such things. Rafilia said, with a smile, that in that case she could easily finish the work that the prince had given her. After some time, Lydia burst into her mistress's room and announced that the prince would soon return to the castle. Rafilia, with a smile, said that he returned just in time, since she had already finished the work he had given her. At the same moment, the young lady said that in this way she would make him herbal tea, because he must be very tired. Lydia looked at her mistress in surprise, because she knew that there was no other wonderful wife like her. At the same time, she understood that the prince had treated his wife with cruelty. After some time, the prince returned to the castle and immediately went to his office. At the same time, he paid attention to the documents that were on his desk. He was surprised because his wife had done a lot of work in such a short time. At the same moment, he turned his attention to a small teapot with tea, and there he saw a note. Rafilia wrote a note to her husband, while Anna congratulated him on his return, and also said that his work is important, but he should pay attention to his health. Silas, in turn, was very surprised, as he did not expect to see such a thing. For some time he walked around the office backwards and forwards, reading a note. But after a moment, he gathered courage and decided to visit his wife. But when he entered her room, he saw that there was no one there. He decided to ask the maid where his wife was now. At the same time, he visited several places, but still could not find a wife. But after some time, he still came to one of the rooms and heard the voice of his wife. Entering inside, he saw his wife, who was the most beautiful of all. Rafilia greeted the prince, and at the same time asked how he was feeling. He took a confused look from his wife and started muttering indistinctly. Rafilia came closer to him and asked in surprise whether he was still not feeling well. At the same moment, the prince embarrassedly declared that everything was fine with him. She smiled, as she was glad to hear such a thing. Silas froze for a moment, with embarrassment on his face, looking at his wife. At the same moment, Lydia came closer to them and asked the prince's forgiveness for interrupting him while he admired his wife. But she informed him that the lady was busy. Rafilia said, with a smile, that it was so, because the queen had invited her and some nobles to a tea party. Unfortunately, she clearly remembered tea drinking before November, as it was not good. Every time the queen gathered noble women who possessed abilities. Rafilia, in her turn, became a laughingstock at this event, because she simply opened her mouth. Unfortunately, she could not forget the suffering and inconvenience she endured at such an event. After a moment, she was startled as she saw that the prince was closely watching how she was getting ready. She looked around together with her maid and asked the prince if he really wanted to tell her something. At the same moment, the prince looked away from her and began muttering something. At the same moment, Lydia looked menacingly at the prince and declared again that her mistress was on her way. She was interested in the event, if he could visit her later. The prince asked for forgiveness for the fact that he had delayed them, but at the same moment, Lydia told the mistress that it was time for them to go. Rafilia answered nothing to anyone, and at the same moment hurried after her maid. But after a moment she froze in place, as her husband grabbed her hand. She turned and looked at him in surprise. The prince did not waste a minute to thank his wife for completing the work he had given her, and he also thanked her for the wonderful tea. A moment later, after his words, he left them. At the same time, the young ladies looked at each other, as they were pleased to hear something similar. Some time later, the queen greeted all the assembled ladies with a smile for coming to her. The ladies with smiles thanked the queen for the invitation, and they also wondered what kind of lady was sitting next to the queen. The queen said with a smile that her companion today, Lady Rafilia, had recently become the prince's wife. At the same moment, the young lady greeted everyone with a smile and also introduced herself. The ladies greeted her with smiles, since it was the first time she visited such an event. At the same moment, the maid served rare sweets. The queen said with a smile that she had ordered wonderful treats in the duchy. Rafilia, in turn, sipped tea with a smile, but at the same time she felt nostalgic. Then she glanced at her maid and realized that she was the only one who stood out at this tea party. For some time, the young ladies chatted among themselves on various topics. Rafilia would like to add a few words to their dialogue, but since last time she interrupted the conversation and talked about botanical herbs, the queen assumed that she was an expert on plants. For this reason, she decided to remain silent and not speak on some topics. At the same moment, the queen said with surprise that the tea had cooled down, but she could warm it up a little. After a few seconds, she used her magic and warmed up the tea. At the same time, everyone present watched her with delight. At the same moment, the queen asked with a smile if they would like to demonstrate their magnificent abilities to each other. The young ladies looked at the queen with joy, as they wanted to demonstrate their abilities. Rafilia, in turn, perfectly understood that the show had begun, and soon the queen would expose her shame. At the same moment, the young lady stood up with a smile, as she was the first one who intended to demonstrate her abilities. After some time, Lydia demonstrated her abilities as a queen, but at the same moment, the queen looked at her companion with a smile and asked her to demonstrate her abilities. For some time, the young lady sat quietly in her place, while everyone present was waiting for her to do something. She knew that she had to resist them one last time. At the same time, she remembered how in her past life, she regretfully declared that she did not have any abilities and therefore could not show anything. Then all those present were shocked, and at the same time they did not understand how she, who did not have abilities, was in the royal family. But then the queen stood up for the lady. Today, she didn't want to fall face down in the mud, so she bowed down and played the violin to her new acquaintances. They happily applauded her. As they heard a beautiful performance, Rafilia, in turn, thanked them with a smile for her beautiful words. The queen was furious because she wanted to replace the ladies, but she didn't succeed. After some time, the young ladies said goodbye, while one of the ladies presented Rafilia with a small gift box and asked Rafilia to open the gift when she was with the prince. Rafilia thanked the girl for such a thing. At the same time, she opened the box and saw that there was alcohol, which was incredibly expensive and delicious. Rafilia said, with a smile, that she would accompany them now. But at the same moment, the queen used her magic, and at the same moment, a vine wrapped around Rafilia's leg. At the same time, the young lady froze for a moment, as she did not expect such a thing. The queen looked at everything that was happening with a bright smile. Lydia rushed to her mistress. Lydia shouted at the lady and asked if everything was okay with her, since no one expected to see something like that. But the lady said that everything was okay with her. At the same minute, she got up from the ground. The overwhelming pain said that she had just twisted her ankle a little. At the same time, knights were passing by them. Owen heard the commotion and rushed to the ladies to find out what happened. Lydia asked for forgiveness and said that her mistress had twisted her leg. Owen, without wasting a minute, took the young lady in his arms and declared that they needed to go to the infirmary immediately. All those present froze in place, as they were very embarrassed by his act. At the same time, they saw that the young man could be relied upon. Lydia told the knight that everything was fine with her, but he insisted that she just hold on to him tighter. After a few minutes, they walked through the castle, but on their way, the lady was met by her husband. At the same time, Silas was stunned by what he saw. Rafilia tightly clung to the knight, as she was very embarrassed by the fact that her husband saw her in such a stupid state. The prince asked his knight what was happening, and he quickly declared that the lady had injured her leg. Silas restrained his rage and asked the knight why he was holding her in his arms. The young man looked bewildered. The hostess pushed him, as he did not understand the essence of the question. At the same moment, the prince looked intently at the young people and again wondered why the knight was holding her in his arms. Owen looked at the prince in bewilderment and said that he could not do anything, because when the lady was injured, there were only women around. The prince was furious that the young man had taken such an initiative. At the same moment, he took his wife and easily threw her on his shoulder. Silas looked askance at his knight and declared that he should call the royal physician to his room. The young people froze for a moment in surprise, as they did not expect such behavior from the prince. For some time they watched in silence as the prince carried his wife on his shoulder. Rafilia could not bear such a thing, and at the same moment shouted to her wife that she could walk, and she should not be carried in such a way. The prince smiled and asked if it wasn't the same when she was next to his knight. At the same moment, he said menacingly that he was her husband and she should rely on him. She understood that his words were true. The prince was interested in whether the knight was much better than him. She sighed and said that she did not say anything like that. After a moment, the prince threw his wife on the bed. Silas looked closely at the lady and declared that she lacked the self-awareness of his wife. Rafilia sighed heavily and declared that the situation was not pleasant, and the knight only helped her. Silas looked at her and said that she shouldn't have clung to the knight like that. She looked at him in surprise. She didn't understand what he was talking about. Rafilia was puzzled because she knew that even though the prince had Lady Grace as a lover, he ignored his actions, but she wondered if this meant that he had possessive feelings for his wife. She sighed and said that he himself said that she should not touch him. Rafilia looked intently and embarrassedly at her husband and said that he himself had previously stated that their lack was just a fiction, so she could not understand his thoughts. He glared at her and declared that prestige was the most important thing, and she should not allow second men to touch her in public. She sighed and wondered if her appearance was more important than her injury. At the same moment, she wondered if she could do anything as long as she was not in public. Silas was enraged by such a question from his wife. At the same moment, he pounced on her and pinned her to the bed. For some time, the young people stared intently at each other. Rafilia looked at the prince in surprise and asked what he was doing. He did not answer her and only stared at her with embarrassment. At the same moment, the prince approached his defenseless wife. She understood that something similar was happening again. Rafilia was embarrassed and frightened, because when his eyes looked at her, she felt as if she was being pulled into a whirlpool. She unconsciously closed her eyes and at the same moment turned away from him. The prince saw a similar reaction, and at the same moment simply pinched her ear and called her. But after a moment they were startled as they heard that the visitors had come to them. Rafilia, with a smile, thanked her maid for bringing the doctor. At the same moment, Lydia looked menacingly at the prince and declared that her mistress was injured, so he should not do anything unreasonable. After some time, Lydia asked her mistress why she should not rest for a while because of her injury. Rafilia said with a smile that she had so much time, so she wanted to do something useful. Rafilia saw the beautiful flowers that the maid had presented to her. Lydia, with a smile, said that she received similar flowers from the gardener who took care of the greenhouse. Rafilia. For a moment, she thought about the greenhouse and wondered if it would be possible for her to visit the greenhouse again someday. But at the same moment, she came to herself and threw such thoughts away. Rafilia understood that she just needed the prince to drink herbal tea as soon as possible. She also remembered the indecent moment of their intimacy. At the same time, she knew that it had been a long time, but she was still uncomfortable. After a moment, the young ladies heard a noise outside the door. A few seconds later, she saw Cain. At the same time, the man asked for forgiveness for disturbing her. Rafilia, with a smile, said that he had come just in time, as she had finished her work, and would like him to hand over everything to the prince. At the same moment, the man drew attention to her leg and asked for forgiveness, asked what the condition of her leg was, since the prince was very worried about it. Rafilia, with a smile, said that everything is fine with her leg, and she planned to go for rehabilitation starting tomorrow. Cain smiled and said that he would convey a similar message to the prince. She looked at him with a smile, and at that moment, the man said that she should come to the prince's bedroom in the evening. At the same time, the young lady came to her husband's bedroom. Entering the room, she saw that he was quietly sitting and waiting for her on the bed. Rafilia asked her husband if he wanted to drink tea before going to bed. He smiled and said that it was an ideal time, because his throat was dry. Sipping tea, the prince smiled and thanked his wife for helping him with the documents. Rafilia smiled and said that she had not done anything like that, and it was a trifle compared to what he had done. At the same moment, The prince said embarrassedly that they could do what she wanted once her leg was restored. She was surprised and did not understand why he said such a thing. But then the prince said that he would like to celebrate her recovery. Rafilia, in turn, wondered if he wanted to thank her for the help with the documents, or if he wanted to apologize for their quarrel the other day. Rafilia said with a smile that she didn't want anything specific, but if he insisted, she would like to ask for the key to the greenhouse, and if she was allowed to use a small area of the greenhouse, she would be happy. Rafilia understood that in the greenhouse, she could grow herbs for the prince's tea, as well as cultivate medicinal plants effective against the epidemic. The prince looked at his wife in surprise and wondered if that was all. He could not believe that Anna was satisfied with only this. Rafilia looked at him in surprise, as she did not understand the question. Then the prince said that he would inform the gardener that she would visit the greenhouse. Rafilia was surprised and asked the prince if he was sure of his decision. At the same moment, she thanked him with a joyful smile and said that she was very happy. But after a moment, the young lady's face changed as she saw the cold look of the prince. She was a little puzzled and surprised as he came closer to her and hugged her tightly. For a few moments they stood motionless, and at the same time he hugged her tightly. At the same moment, she embarrassedly declared that there were no spectators near them and there was no need to continue portraying the devoted couple. Silas sighed heavily and quietly declared that she was his wife, and that gave him the right to touch her. She was surprised by such an argument, and at the same moment she wondered if she had no right to touch him. After all, he was her husband. She said that he previously pushed her hand away in the carriage and forbade her to touch him when he was sick, and this caused her deep pain. Rafilia declared that it was completely unfair that only the husband stood up for his rights. She also regretted the words spoken the other day, but she also wanted him to apologize to her. After a moment, the young lady hugged her husband, and he froze in place in shock. She looked intently and embarrassed into his eyes, as she expected him to apologize to her. Silas, in turn, froze for a moment as he did not expect such a thing from his wife. At the same moment, he sighed heavily and declared that it was his fault. She smiled and said that now they are ready. Rafilia said with a smile that they could accept this as their truce and put an end to this matter. But after a moment, the young lady looked at her husband again with bewilderment. He looked at her embarrassedly and said that the more he learned about her, the more sides Anna revealed. He knew that before she was quiet, and therefore he wanted to know if she was hiding her true nature. Rafilia with a smile said that it was not so, and she was just a little nervous in front of him. Rafilia desperately wanted to play the role of an obedient and ideal wife, but in her first life, she died without waiting for all her efforts to bear fruit. But watching her husband, she could not even imagine that he had humanity. At the same moment, the prince reached out to his wife, and after a moment, he tenderly kissed her neck. Rafilia was very embarrassed, as she did not expect this. But after a moment, he threw her on the bed. Silas continued to kiss his wife tenderly, while she was puzzled and did not understand what he was doing. For some time they looked at each other confusedly, not deciding to do anything. Lydia was frightened because in her past life she had never encountered anything like this. Rafilia looked at her husband in bewilderment, since they had never touched each other before. She watched intently as he quietly undressed, and at the same time she understood that nothing similar had happened in both of their lives. But after a moment, she saw a small mark on his shoulder. Rafilia, with a smile, stated that she had thought about his mark before, since she managed to see the rare violet shade as he writhed in agony. After her words, the prince turned away from her. At the same moment, he sighed heavily and declared that it was already late and they should go to bed. Lady looked at him in surprise, as she did not expect such an outcome at all. For some time she sat quietly on the bed and gazed intently at the prince. Rafilia, in turn, wondered if she had said something strange. Compared to her previous life, her current existence is much more saturated. She was no longer useless, and she did not wait for time to slip away aimlessly from her. Rafilia now enjoyed every day, as she had companions to communicate with. She was also glad that her relationship with her husband was not as bad as in her previous life, although at night he no longer touched her. After a moment, the young man asked his wife if she really had cold feet. She sighed and said that they were cold, but a little. At the same moment, without thinking, he tried to warm her with his feet. Rafilia smiled and thanked his wife for such a thing. At the same time, she knew that even though he was cold on the outside, he had a kind heart, But after some time, she again saw a not very pleasant picture, as her husband again left Lady Grace. At the same moment, Lydia informed her mistress that the prince would not return for several days. She asked her mistress if she had assumed that this was yet another secret meeting of theirs. Rafilia said that it was so. Lydia was puzzled and did not understand why everything continued to happen in this way, because they began to get along with each other. She shouted that she simply did not understand the prince. Rafilia said that perhaps he had an emptiness in his heart that she could not fill, because she knew that the marriage contract and the heart are different things. Lydia knew that this was so, but still it was unpleasant for her to see such a thing. Rafilia said, with a smile, that she is truly happy now, so there is no need to worry about anything. At the same moment, the young lady approached her maid and thanked her with a smile for her support, because she knew that her friend was very kind. Compared to what was before, this life is filled with great happiness, which she deserved. In addition, the young lady was well aware of the fact that they would eventually have to divorce. She knew that each of them should strive for their own happiness. After a moment, the young ladies looked into the distance in amazement as Owen came to the lady and asked where the prince was. She looked at the knight in surprise, as it seemed that he had not heard that the prince had left the castle not long ago. He was surprised by such a thing, but at the same moment, Lydia declared that he would be absent for several days. At the same time, she was interested in where he left every time with the lady. At the same time, Owen suggested that, most likely, this was the cancellation phase. Lady looked at him in surprise, as she did not understand what he was talking about. Owen hesitated, as he realized that he had spoken his thoughts out loud. At the same moment, he announced that the prince had a chronic disease, and he had been suffering from it for a long time, and once every few months, there was a period when the attacks became stronger. Owen said with a smile that he suspected that the prince had left the castle to recuperate. Lady was a little puzzled by everything she heard, because she assumed something similar, but did not know that everything was so serious. She was angry with the prince, as he suffered from a chronic disease, while he carefully hid everything from her. At the same moment, Lydia declared that the royal physician, undoubtedly, should have been with the prince, but for some reason he was in the castle and resting. The young man was surprised, and at the same moment froze in a daze, as he did not know what to answer them. Rafilia perfectly understood that the prince was safe because Lady and Grace took care of him, but she also understood that depending on the nature of his chronic disease, the herbal tea she was preparing could potentially have adverse consequences. She understood that she needed to know the details of his illness, but then she looked intently at her companion and said that if he knew the whole truth, then he should tell her everything. Rafilia 5 looked menacingly at the young man and declared that it is a wife's duty to worry about her husband's condition and support him. Owen perfectly understood that she was right. However, if he did not speak carefully, it would jeopardize the trust that he shared with the prince. Unfortunately, he didn't know much. At the same time, he said that she could learn all the information about this question from Alfred. The young lady was taken aback for a moment, as she had never heard this name before. Owen stated that the man was the old caretaker, who had previously looked after the prince, and instead of relying on him, it would be better to ask the old man for a new explanation. Owen perfectly understood that the man could provide her with detailed information about the prince's condition. At the same moment, he took out a pen and a letter. After a moment, he gave the young lady the man's address. Owen stated that the man was deep in the mountains, but there were no monsters in that area, so it was safe there, although he hadn't seen the man in a long time, so he couldn't guarantee that he was still there. He left with a smile, said that the lady could visit the old man, while the young lady thanked him with a smile for such a thing. Lydia was excited, told the lady that she would go with her, but the lady thanked her for this and said that she would go on the journey herself. Rafilia knew very well that the prince would not want everyone to know about his chronic illness, so she intended to go alone and find out about everything. After some time, the young lady still went on her way. She arrived at the indicated address, but still did not dare to enter the house for some time. A moment later, she heard a man's voice. Turning, she clearly saw the old man who was heading towards her. Rafilia greeted the man with a smile, while she was very glad that he was there. But after a moment, all her joyful mood vanished, as she saw that the old man did not see her. She stared at him for some time, and at the same time, she wondered what had become of his eyes. Some time later, the young lady was drinking tea with a new acquaintance, and she thanked him for his hospitality with a smile. The man said with a smile that she could not address him so officially. He was also extremely surprised that the bride of the prince came to visit him. She smiled and asked for forgiveness for her sudden appearance. At the same moment, the young lady introduced herself. Alfred, in turn, pronounced her name several times and then gave her maiden name. She was extremely surprised because she did not expect that he would know her from somewhere. The man smiled and said that he was right, because earlier it seemed to him that her voice was very familiar. Alfred asked for forgiveness, asked if he could touch her face. The man said that how she could see his eyes were blind, so he wanted to confirm his assumptions by touching her. Rafilia was surprised, but still she gave the old man such an opportunity. A few minutes later, the man said that it was really her. He was surprised and could not think at all that she would be the prince's marriage partner, and he called her Leia. Rafilia was a bit puzzled, as she remembered that she had once been called by such a name, but she did not remember where or when. Alfred said, with a smile, that it was about 13 years ago. He asked the girl if she remembers a tall tower in the depths of a foggy forest. She looked at him with bewilderment, as she understood what he was talking about. But after a moment, she remembered long-forgotten memories, because one fine day she was collecting plants and got lost deep in the forest. Now she knew that she was lost in the foggy forest. And then she saw a beautiful tall tower on her way. But she also saw a man in a tower. The young lady was surprised by her find, as she did not expect such a thing. But after a moment she was taken aback, as she saw an old man who was surprised to notice a child in such a wilderness. He assumed that everything had changed for him, but then she greeted the old man with a smile and introduced herself. He came closer to her because he wanted to know if she was real. Rafilia told the old man with a smile that she heard the voice of the boy who was at the very top of the tower. After the man's story, she wondered with surprise if he really was the same mister from the tower. He smiled and said that it was so. They talked sweetly for some time, sitting over tea. After that, the lady found out that a boy several years older than her lived in the tower, and it was he who found her and asked the old man to check if she was real. That day, she received a map of the city and was able to get home safely. The next day, relying on the map, she again came to the tower. She wanted to thank the boy in the tower, so she brought a letter and a small bouquet of flowers that she made herself. She wanted to give them to the man, but then she saw that from the top of the tower, the boy lowered a small basket that was tied to a rope. She saw a beautiful stone inside the basket and a reply letter. Then she was happy and excited, and since then she began to visit the tower often. They could not see each other's faces, but they exchanged letters, and at the same time, they were able to become good friends. She found out that he could not leave the tower due to some circumstances. Also, the young lady found out that his mother died a few years ago. He wrote that he was bored and wanted to hear some stories, but according to the old man's order, they never told their true personalities. Nevertheless, this time was really fun, but when her parents found out about her walks in the forest, they restricted her access. After a moment, the young lady smiled as she realized that she did not come up with a fictitious name, but simply shortened her present one. The old man smiled and said that it was nice of her, but after a moment, she realized that surrendering to memories, she forgot the most important thing. At the same moment, the young lady looked at the old man and called him. She brought up that all this time, he thought that Leah would be the prince's partner in marriage. At the same moment, the man sighed heavily and declared that the boy in the tower was the prince himself. Rafilia was shocked, because she could not imagine that the boy was a prince. Even in his previous life, she did not know such a thing. She could not believe that she had learned a new fact about her spouse just now. But she wanted to know if the prince knew about it. Alfred said that, most likely, he did not understand, because he did not know her voice of the real name of the person. She smiled and said that he was right, because if the prince found out about this, he would be very surprised. At the same time, the young lady wondered if it was necessary to tell him about this if they were going to divorce. At the same moment, she looked intently at the old man and said that she had come to him because she wanted to ask him something. He sighed heavily, as he understood that she wanted to talk about the prince's curse. Lydia was surprised, as it was believed that the prince had a chronic illness. Alfred sighed and declared that he had to tell her everything, because she had the right to hear the truth, and he wanted her to know everything. Those who wore the purple mark wanted and possessed a powerful force in their bodies. They were born with a similar curse. Alfred told the lady that this prophecy had been handed down in the king's family since ancient times, and it was completely secret information that could never be disclosed. At the same moment, the young lady remembered the blue mark she saw on the prince's shoulder. Alfred sighed and said that the prince was born with a mark, and they said that the owners of the mark were powerful, and they should bring peace and prosperity to the country. However, on the other hand, until they reach adulthood and the curse is not lifted, there was a risk that the abilities would go out of control, and in this way, a person could destroy the whole country. Lydia was shocked that a person could be so powerful. Then she realized that the king was afraid of his own son because of his strength, so he locked him in the tower. Rafilia looked at the old man with bewilderment, because she knew that the prince had reached the age of majority, and at the same time he lived in an ordinary castle, and she suspected that the curse had been lifted. The man sighed heavily and declared that this is exactly how everything should have been. She looked at him in surprise, as she understood that not everything is so simple. After some time, the young lady rummaged in the greenhouse, collecting herbs. She felt peace and tranquility. But still, she understood that she should not stay in the greenhouse for a long time, as she wanted to go to the foggy forest. She slowly drove through the forest and watched the beauty. But still her thoughts were far from the beauty of the forest, as she remembered the conversation with Alfred about the prince. Then she asked the man if the curse had not been lifted. He sighed and said that it had not been lifted. After a moment, he told her that there were records that showed that 400 years ago, a child with a purple mark was born in the royal family. It was known that such a man could not control his power and was imprisoned in a stone tower. But as soon as he reached adulthood, the curse was lifted. And as it was predicted, such a man led the nation to an era of great prosperity. The king followed the same example and imprisoned the prince. Later, he released him after he came of age. At first, everything was good, and the prince's rule was magnificent. He managed to unite the ministers, who were divided by factions, and smoothly passed through the parliament legislation that had been at a standstill for a long time. Alfred told the ladies that the king was beside himself with joy. He knew that a golden age would soon be waiting for them. But a few months later, the killer broke into the castle and broke into the prince's bedroom. Although it was self-defense, but the prince got out of control, the intruder hid. But the prince could not control the force and eventually destroyed the room. When Alfred rushed to the prince, he was already writhing in pain from the mark on his hand. Earlier, Alfred had already seen a similar riot that took place in the tower. It was then that he realized that the curse had not been lifted. Just as she was surprised and did not understand why the curse had not been lifted, Alfred stated that perhaps there was some necessary condition besides the attainment of adulthood. When he heard about this, the king became furious. For this reason, he expelled Alfred from the castle. The prince came to the defense of his old friend, but the king was adamant. Then the man was forced to leave the castle walls. The young lady sighed heavily, as she understood that this was cruel. Alfred said that he learned from the letter about the prince's condition, and that the king had imposed a ban on the use of the prince's power, and now he was simply fulfilling his state duties. Unfortunately, the prince suffered from seizures, and therefore he had to shut himself up in the damp tower for the greater good. She was puzzled as she understood that he was still suffering from the curse. At the same time, the lady knew that he was suffering because of the bullying of the king, but still she did not want to leave him alone in this situation. The coachman was surprised to ask the lady if she was sure that she had arrived at the right place. She smiled and said that everything would be fine with her. He didn't need to worry. Rafilia knew that the tower must be a secret, so she walked for some time to the destination. She remembered the way, so she easily reached the tower. After a moment, she was flooded with memories from her past life. She remembered this tower and remembered the moment when she rushed to her husband with all her legs. She sighed heavily as she was pierced by the pain of memories. She remembered the moment when she saw the prince meet his end in the tower. Rafilia, in turn, was very upset at that moment and therefore did not recognize the tower. After a moment, she saw Cain, who was looking at the lady with surprise. He was puzzled and did not understand why she was in such a place. At the same moment, he sighed heavily and declared that he was very sorry, but she could not go to the tower. Rafilia stated without a doubt that she had known about this place and the prince for a long time. She was also familiar with Alfred and had heard about this situation. Cain was surprised, but still accepted her words. At the same time, he knew that he should ask the prince for confirmation of her passage to the tower. Rafilia, in turn, pushed the man away and said that there was no need for this, as she had the determination and the right to enter the tower. She perfectly understood that if the man asked permission from the prince, she would not enter the tower, so she decided to go straight ahead. Rising higher and higher, she became convinced that she had been in the tower in her past life. While she heard that the tower was built entirely from a barrier stone that blocked the power of the prince. After a moment, the young lady approached the door, but for some time she did not dare to enter. But after a moment, she entered and saw her husband, who was quietly lying on the bed. She saw how he trembled from pain. At the same time, the young lady quietly called her husband's wedding. He turned and looked at his wife with horror, as he did not expect to see her. Rafilia looked at the prince with a smile and asked how he was feeling. At the same moment, he rushed at her and asked why she was in such a place. At the same time, he unconsciously used his power. The young lady froze for a moment in a stupor, as a stream of ego power flooded her. For some time she stood silently and looked at him. After a moment, she still decided to say a word. But at the same moment, the prince shouted furiously for her to leave immediately. The prince could not stand it, and at the same moment shouted again for her to go away. At the same time, he unknowingly released his power. The young lady was startled for a moment and froze in place, as she saw that because of his strength, the bookcase shook and a book fell on her. The prince was startled and came to his senses, but at the same time, he looked at his wife with horror, as the wardrobe moved and books fell on her. The young lady easily managed to avoid such a thing, and at the same time, she managed to hold the wardrobe, which almost fell. At the same moment she turned, as Silas, with regret in his voice, asked the lady to leave. He looked away from her because he was uncomfortable, while he said that he did not know why she was in such a place, but he wanted her to leave. Rafilia looked intently at her husband and said that Anna had recently met Alfred. The prince was surprised, as he did not expect to hear such a thing. He looked at her in surprise and wondered what she meant. Rafilia said that the man told her about the prince's situation and why he was in such a place. Silas bewilderedly asked his wife what she was talking about, because he understood that even if she was his wife, Alfred should not have told something like that to a complete stranger. She smiled and said that they had already met, and this was not the first time. The prince asked for forgiveness and declared that he had no idea what she was talking about. Lady smiled and said that she would definitely tell him everything, but first she wanted to spread the flowers. Rafilia looked at the prince with a smile after a short story. At the same time, she said that she could not have thought that her childhood pen pal would turn out to be a prince. Rafilia said, with a smile, that she still kept the stone and the letters he gave her. He was embarrassed and asked her not to say a word. The young man was very surprised, and he simply could not imagine that his childhood friend was his current wife. He knew that the lady was a kind, active girl who always loved plants. To his regret, he knew that then he had nothing to give her, except for the fragments of the walls of the tower, which were blown to pieces during his rampage. Also, he saw his friend once an hour, and apart from that, he had no contact with anyone of his age. In those days of insane loneliness and boredom, he met a lady. These moments remained vivid memories even now. After a moment, the prince came to himself and threw all his thoughts away. Lady wondered if he could not sleep because of the pain. Rafilia, with a smile, said that she had prepared him herbal tea, which had strong sedative and soporific properties. She also reported that Alfred said that the prince could drink something similar. Sipping tea, the prince quietly asked his wife if she was not afraid of him. Silas stated that he was in a state that he could not control. He did not understand how she could stay in the room when she knew such things. The young lady smiled and said that she would be lying if she said that she was not afraid. But looking at her husband, she said that he would never harm her. Rafilia said that she had seen him lose control before, and now he also lost control. But she still did not suffer. The prince sighed heavily and declared that it was a simple coincidence, and next time she might get hurt. She smiled and said that it will not be his fault, and if something like this happens, she will blame only herself. He was surprised by what he heard, but he understood that he could not convince her, and he understood that she would not leave him. After a moment, he remembered the old days, and those flower wreaths that she made for him. The prince declared that he gave one wreath to Alfred, and he wore it. Rafilia looked at the prince with a smile, as such memories made her nostalgic. At the same moment, the prince remembered his spouse's sister, as they had the same faces. Rafilia, with a smile, said that she has a twin sister, and people often confuse them. Rafilia, with a smile, said that the sister always said that a prince lived at the top of the tower, but she never attached any meaning to such words. After a moment, the young lady noticed that her husband was quietly sleeping. She wrapped him with tenderness and care. At the same time, looking at her husband, she understood that the physical consequences were huge, but she could not imagine how much mental pain he had experienced during all this time. She sighed heavily, as unfortunately, she didn't know anything about his past life. Looking at her husband, she heard that he was quietly mumbling something in his sleep. Rafilia reached out to her husband and tenderly stroked him, assuring him that everything would be fine. Now that she knew the whole truth, she wanted to ease his suffering, even for a moment, before their divorce. After some time, she returned to the castle. While the maid declared that the prince had already returned, Rafilia said with a smile that she saw him from the window. Rafilia was very glad that the prince was recovering, while she hoped that her tea helped the prince at least a little. At the same moment, Lydia called the mistress and said that she was terribly sorry, but she had one small request. Lydia said that something had happened in Drunken in the western region, where her brother lives, and she might have to return home for a few days. Rafilia was interested in what had happened, and at the same moment, the maid declared that she had received news that the villagers were sick for an unknown reason. She was worried about the village and about her brother, so she wanted to go there. Rafilia, in turn, was shocked by what she heard. She understood that she could not let the maid go, since it seems that it was about an epidemic. After some time, the young lady came to the prince with a request to go to the village, but he refused her and asked why she was returning to the same place for inspection. He said that the construction of the water pipeline in the western region went smoothly, so there were no problems. Rafilia, in the same moment, declared that she herself wanted to see progress. She wanted to make sure whether they really used clean water, and at the same time, she wanted to know whether the apothecary was using the herbs that she presented to him. She wanted to make sure of everything, but at the same moment, all her thoughts flew away, as Owen entered the office and greeted everyone with a smile. He looked at the lady in surprise, as he did not expect to see her. At the same moment, the prince announced that the route to the western region passes through dangerous areas. Owen asked with a smile if they were going on a trip, and he offered his candidacy as a security guard. Rafilia looked at the knight with joy and asked if he was really ready to accompany her. She thanked him with a smile, but at the same moment, the prince couldn't stand it and banged loudly on the table. Everyone looked at him in bewilderment. At the same moment, the prince announced to his wife that he would go with her. After some time, the young people arrived in full force in the western village. Owen surveyed the surroundings with a smile, as he was in a similar place for the first time. The prince looked menacingly at his friend and said that he was close to the girls, so he had no reason to go together with them. But the knight said that it was useful for him to get out of the castle occasionally. After a moment, the villagers greeted the prince with joy. At the same moment, they said that thanks to the prince, they had no problems with clean water. They looked at the prince with joy, because everything happened thanks to him. Rafilia looked at everyone present with a smile, as she was glad to hear such a thing. But after a moment, she noticed that the girl was not feeling well, and at the same minute, the girl reported that she had recently caught a cold, and perhaps she caught it. Rafilia was excited because she knew that the epidemic began with symptoms almost identical to those of a common cold. The man said that the medicine from the village pharmacy is very effective, and people who fought for recovery felt better as soon as they took the medicine. Rafilia, in turn, was surprised. But at the same moment, she felt joy, as she understood that the apothecary listened to her words, and at the same time, he used herbs to make medicine. At the same moment, the young ladies looked into the distance as they heard the boy's voice. The boy ran to his older sister with a smile and greeted her. At the same moment, he threw himself into her arms with a joyful smile. Rafilia looked at the cute boy with a smile, because she understood that he was the one who threw the stone at the prince. Lydia looked intently at her brother and peppered him with questions, as she wanted to know if he had caught a cold. Finn said that everything was fine with him, but most importantly, he wanted to tell the news that there would soon be a school in their village. Lydia was surprised, but the elder said that this is so, and the school is in the process of construction using state grants. The elder looked closely at the prince and declared that everything was happening thanks to his diligence. Owen looked at his friend with a smile and said that he was simply incredible because he had achieved something like this. At the same moment, Finn approached the prince and thanked him with a joyful smile. Without wasting a minute, the boy bowed his head before the prince and declared that he was very sorry for what he had done before. Lydia looked at her brother in surprise, as she did not understand what he was talking about. At the same moment, the prince gently patted the boy on the head and declared that everything happened thanks to his courage. He also did not forget to thank the boy for this. Rafilia looked at them with a satisfied smile, as she was happy with such an outcome. That evening, she sat quietly in her room, as she was very tired during the day. She wondered if her maid was having a good time with her brother, while she understood that she would be lonely because she would not see the maid for a whole week. A moment later, the young lady saw a beautiful gift on her shelf, namely a bottle of wine. She remembered how the lady said that she should open the bottle with her husband, but at the same time, she wondered if she should try the drink herself. But after a few seconds, she turned around as she heard footsteps in her room. She looked at her husband with surprise and wondered if something was wrong, because he came to her. He sighed heavily and said that everything was fine, while they looked at each other in silence for a while. Let the prince have the courage to ask if she would like to have dinner with him. At the same moment, she remembered a beautiful bottle of wine. After a moment, they began to have dinner, and at the same time the young lady thanked the prince with a smile for his hard work. He looked at her with a smile and thanked her for such words. At the same moment, the young lady began to drink. After a moment, they looked at each other in amazement. After tasting the drink, they realized that it was delicious. After drinking the beautiful drink, the young lady refreshed her face. She happily conducted a dialogue with her husband, and he looked at her tenderly. After some time, the lady thanked her husband for going with them, because thanks to this, she was able to see the fruits of their labor. He looked intently at her, and with a heavy sigh declared that he is the one who is constantly saved by her. She looked at her husband in surprise and asked what he meant. The prince said that since she mentioned the problem of water supply, it was quickly solved. This also became the key to solving various problems, not only in the water supply. She said with a smile that he really did a lot, and she did not participate in it. The prince looked at his companion in bewilderment, as he understood that she had done a lot. He sighed heavily and, looking at his wife, said that she had done a lot, even when he was in the tower. After all, at that time he lost his own mother and was in despair for a long time. Silas said that his sense of isolation pushed him to do this in order to bring trouble to Alfred. Looking at his wife, he sighed heavily and declared that, to his shame, he took out his anger on his friend, whom he rarely saw. Silas said with embarrassment that thanks to those moments when she visited the tower, he felt calm and peace. For this reason, he was sure that he was saved by her. He was sincerely grateful to her for her beautiful and clean writing and flowers. When I asked why his mother died, he sighed and said that it was an illness, and he couldn't do anything except watch her wither before his eyes. The prince was furious because his father never hated his wife, and he did not allow her to receive proper medical care. However, she never once said a bad word about his wife. She never complained about her cursed son or her husband. At the same moment, he sighed heavily and declared that he was very sorry, and he was not going to talk about something dark at all. Lydia sighed heavily and declared that his mother really loved him, and he, in turn, also loved his mother. Rafilia perfectly understood that this was a painful experience for him. He sighed and said that he intended to invite her to dinner for him to express his gratitude. But at the same time, he created an awkward atmosphere. Rafilia said, with a smile, that this was not the case, because she was glad to hear about his mother. He smiled and wondered if it was so, but at the same moment, he saw tears on his wife's face. Silas. At the same moment, he was surprised and asked what had happened. Rafilia K, unfortunately, after a hot drink, gave in to her emotions and asked the prince not to say that he was cursed or something like that. The prince was shocked as he realized that he had not even finished one glass of wine, and there was almost nothing left in the bottle. Rafilia could not stand it and shouted that the prince is a wonderful person. She continued to shout and list all his virtues, but at the same moment she declared that there was no one more suitable for the role of king than he. Rafilia said without a doubt that soon the curse would disappear and he would become happy. She shouted that she had guaranteed him something similar, while the prince was shocked by her condition, and at the same time, he asked her to calm down. Rafilia looked at the prince with a happy smile, as he kindly called her. The prince was surprised and said that he accidentally called her a similar name, since his friend always called her that. At the same moment, she smiled and said that she was happy, but after a moment she collapsed on the table. The prince looked at his wife in amazement as he saw that she was just quietly and peacefully sleeping on the table. He was puzzled by everything that was happening and could not believe that she just fell asleep. But nevertheless, after some time he took her in his arms, as he wanted to carry her to bed. He easily put it in pastel, but in turn stared at it for a while. At the same moment, he heard his wife muttering something in her sleep. Silas gave in to his emotions, and at the same moment approached his wife, as he wanted to kiss her. But after a moment, he still moved away from her. Rafilia, not suspecting anything, turned to the other's side. He sighed heavily, as he understood that she should never drink in the presence of anyone except him. The next morning, the young lady was writhing naked after a hangover, but at the same time, she hoped that the tea would help her to fix this. Rafilia sighed, as she knew that the prince looked shaken after everything that had happened. Some time ago, she told the prince that she was sorry that she fell asleep in the middle of their meal. At the same moment, the prince was interested in how much she remembered from their conversation. Rafilia said that she remembers the conversation until the moment when he started talking about his mother. She sighed heavily and timidly wondered if she had done something rude. Rafilia came closer to the prince as she noticed that he had dark circles under his eyes. She wondered if he had not slept. Silas looked away from her and menacingly asked whose fault it was. But at the same moment, he declared that from now on, she should drink alcohol only in his room and in his presence. She sighed and declared that she understood everything. At the same time, the young lady did not understand what she said, since he was so upset. But she still understood that this alcohol was delicious. After a moment, the young lady heard a noise outside the door, and at the same moment, she hurried to the door. But when she opened the door, she was taken aback for a moment, as she saw the queen in person. Rafilia greeted the queen and also asked what had happened. The queen said that she came alone to talk. The queen looked intently at the lady and declared that lately she had behaved above her position. Rafilia looked at the queen in surprise, as she did not understand what she was talking about. The queen was angry because she saw that the girl participated in field inspections together with the prince and helped him in his work, and she even poked her nose into national politics. Rafilia looked at the queen in bewilderment and declared that this was not so, and she did not poke her nose where it was not needed. The queen angrily approached the girl and declared that she was desperately trying to lower the king's mood and would appropriate someone else's merits. Rafilia was taken aback and declared that this was not so, but at the same moment the queen shouted and declared that the fact that the lady answered her all the time proved that she did not know her place. The young lady was taken aback and immediately asked for forgiveness. The queen said with fury that even the prince was becoming unpleasant, while she noticed that they were perfectly suited to each other since both did not know their places. The queen declared that regardless of this, if they try to carry out any more stupid plans, she will be forced to sue them for exceeding their powers. Young Lady Grace approached them and asked for forgiveness for interrupting their conversation. She said that the prince had improved poor areas and developed infrastructure. She also said that it eased the anxiety of the inhabitants, and their mistrust of the country was reduced to nothing, and therefore it had a positive effect on the kingdom. She said that she perfectly understood that the queen did not want to leave the castle because of the exile during the rebellion. Grace looked at the lady and said that she wanted peace, and therefore tried to develop the country. The queen sighed heavily, because she noticed that Grace was too kind, and at the same time, the queen said that she had nothing to add, since such a high-level user of abilities said the same thing. Grace smiled and said that whether a person has abilities or not is a trivial matter, and the most important thing is what the person wanted. Grace looked at the lady with a smile and asked if she was telling the truth. Rafilia, in turn, had no abilities, so she could not answer such a question. But nevertheless, the young lady was very much surprised by Grace's abilities. Even in relation to the queen, she maintained a decisive position, while she really understood the state of affairs in the country and the will of the prince. At the same moment, the maid asked for forgiveness and told the queen that guests had come to her. The queen looked intently at the girls and declared that it was time for her to leave them. Rafilia looked at the lady with a smile and thanked her for such words. At the same moment, she wondered in surprise if she had any business. Grace declared that she did and asked the lady for a few minutes of her time, as she wanted to talk. Rafilia asked the guest for forgiveness, as her maid had left, and therefore she had to serve the guest herself. Grace smiled and apologized for making the lady take care of herself. Rafilia looked at the lady in bewilderment, as she understood that now the wife and the lover were in the same room. She understood that if her maid had been there, everything could have turned into a disaster. But looking at the girl nearby, she was convinced that the lady possessed a beautiful aura and unprecedented beauty. She saw in front of her a holy, beautiful, wise woman, as well as a lady who was absolutely trusted by both citizens and the royal family. She didn't know the details, but she heard that Grace had served in the royal family for generations and participated in state affairs. At the same moment, Grace Lady, Rafilia, since she was deeply immersed in her thoughts. Grace looked closely at the girl and wondered if she knew about the prince's circumstances, as she had seen the lady leave the tower. Rafilia looked at the lady in bewilderment and declared that it was so. Lady Grace sighed as she realized that her assumptions were correct. Grace looked at the lady with a smile and stated that she thought she had already heard something similar from the prince. But since the prince had left the tower, she had applied ability control techniques to him. The young lady looked at her companion in surprise, as she did not understand what she was talking about. The lady said that her family used barriers and protective techniques for generations. They served to protect the royal family. Rafilia looked at the young lady in surprise, as she had never heard such a thing before. She had heard that ability control techniques were applied to the prince, but she did not know that it was Lady Grace who did it. Lady looked at her intently and said that there is one thing that she must tell her. That is why she came to visit her. Rafilia looked intently at the girl and said that she was listening to her attentively. Lady Grace told the girl that she was too frivolous about the power of the prince's curse. She said that the lady did not think when she entered the tower. Grace said that she could protect herself with her own methods of protection, but it was extremely dangerous for those who did not have the ability to protect themselves. Especially, it was dangerous for a simple person who did not have the ability at all. She said that a lady without abilities should not enter the tower. The lady with a sly smile said that with the help of the ring that she had, as well as the prince, she could monitor his condition. She also told the young lady that if anything happened to him, she would certainly run to him. Rafilia was puzzled and knew very well that she had no abilities. She also knew that Grace was the one who should be by the prince's side. As the young lady was leaving, she declared that she loved the prince with all her heart, and she would be grateful to the girl if she would allow her to continue serving him. The next day, the young lady went about her business, pondering Lady Grace's words about the fact that she truly loves the prince. Rafilia, in turn, wondered what their conversation meant, and at the same time, she wondered if the lady simply wanted her to recognize their relationship. Rafilia understood that the truth was that there was no one more suitable for the role of the prince's wife, except Lady Grace. Since she was popular, there were legends about her beauty, her character and strength were at a height. Rafilia was very upset because she knew that Grace was much better than her. She was once again convinced that divorce was the right decision. But a moment later, a maid entered her room and greeted her with a smile. She looked at her mistress with a smile and thanked her for giving her leave. Rafilia looked at the maid in surprise, because not even a week had passed, and she had already returned. Lydia said that her brother and everyone in the city felt good. At the same time, Lydia was indignant, since the lady did all the work for her. She said about her mistress that she could have asked the maids to clean up. Rafilia told the maid with a smile that she was her only maid, and she didn't need anyone in return. After a moment, Lydia said that on her way back to the castle, she learned that a lingering cold had also spread in the neighboring town. She heard that many people came to their garden to buy medicine. Rafilia was puzzled by this, but at the same time she knew that they distributed herbs in several cities that were visited during the inspection. Lydia said that some people refused medicine because they weren't sure if it would work, and that's why some people died. Young lady planted herbs that could help, and later become medicine, but she understood that forcing all the sick to drink such an infusion would be a difficult task. She could only pray that the epidemic would not spread further. After a moment, she saw the knight, who greeted her with a smile through the window. with a smile that the inspection from the western region the other day was a very funny excursion, but the lady knew that it was not an excursion, but work. He said with a smile that he meant the time when they were riding in the carriage, since they were talking about different topics. She knew that this was so, but when they left, the prince scolded her and said that she should not mindlessly show her sleeping face to others, especially in front of a strange man. At the same moment, the young lady was startled and looked at the knight in surprise, as he coughed, and at the same time, she saw that he was not in a very good condition. Rafilia asked if everything was okay with him. Owen asked for forgiveness and said that he felt a little unimportant since yesterday. At the same moment, he said that the temperature in the greenhouse was very high because of the sun. The young lady looked at him in bewilderment, because he was wrong, but after a moment she understood what was the matter. At the same moment she approached him and, asking for forgiveness, touched his face. Meanwhile, the prince came closer to them and froze when he saw a similar picture. Rafilia looked at the young man with horror and said that it was very serious, because he had a fever. He sighed heavily, as he did not believe her words. But after a moment, he staggered and simply collapsed on top of his companion. She was puzzled because after a moment, she saw that her body had symptoms of an epidemic. At the same moment, the prince could not stand it and angrily asked what was going on. Rafilia looked at the prince in surprise and said that he came just in time, while she asked him for help. He looked at her with bewilderment, as he did not expect such audacity. After some time, young people visited the infirmary. After the examination, the doctor said that he assumed that the knight had a simple cold, but he was a little worried because he had a very high temperature. At the same moment, he sighed heavily and declared that since he had already seen several spots of the rash, he could assume that it was a new epidemic. Looking at the couple, he said that they needed to move further away in order to protect themselves. Rafilia declared that everything would be fine with her, and at the same time she asked permission to stay to look after the lord. The man was surprised by this, but she knew that it was undoubtedly an epidemic, and she assumed that he had caught it during the last check. She could not leave the young man, because she knew that at such a rate he would die, and it would be a strong blow for her husband. Rafilia understood very well that the symptoms progressed very quickly, and she needed to make him take the medicine immediately. Unfortunately, she didn't have time to dry them or mix them, so she just wanted to make tea and give it to the young man to drink. At the same moment, the young lady tenderly touched the knight and asked him to wait a little, because she intended to prepare a medicine. He sighed heavily and opened his eyes with bewilderment, looked at the lady. At the same moment, she came closer to him. The prince did not like this, and looking at his wife, he said that she spoke similar words, as if this night was critical for the knight. He knew that his friend would not die from this, but at the same time, he did not understand why she was so devoted to the knight, even despite the risk of illness. At the same moment, she approached him and threatened that she just knew that every second counted, and now was not the time for idle talk. Silas looked angrily at his wife and declared that this is a very important question. She shouted with the same fury that the situation was now critical. At the same moment, the young lady threw aside empty talk and rushed to brew medicine. The prince was furious, and at the same time he did not understand why she behaved with him in such a way. After some time, the young lady reached Bolney and said with a smile that she had brought him herbal tea. Rafilia asked the young man to drink the infusion. The young man was taken aback and declared that the medicine looked incredibly bitter. Rafilia, with a smile, said that it is so, but this remedy is known for its high efficiency. At the same moment, the young man wrapped himself tightly in a blanket and declared that he was not taking medicine, and usually, after a few days, he recovered naturally. Rafilia was startled by such a thing, but at the same moment she began to beg, as she wanted him to drink while standing, but he declared that everything was fine. Rafilia pulled herself closer to the young man and said that he couldn't be hurt. At the same time, the prince looked menacingly at them. Rafilia declared that she did not want to see him suffer at all. She said that it would be much easier for him as soon as he drank the infusion. After a moment, the young man still accepted the infusion, but he really thought that it was not such a big problem. But since it went so far, he was ready to sacrifice his principles. After a moment, she happily looked at the young lord, as she was glad that he accepted the infusion. Owen sighed heavily, because the infusion was very bitter. She looked at him with a smile, because now she could rest well. But after a moment, she said that he needed to change before going to bed. She reached out to the Lord as she wanted to help him, but the prince grabbed her hand and declared that he would take over this process. At the same moment, looking at his wife, he announced that he would ask the doctor to change places with him, and she should take a bath and wait for him in his room. The young lady was extremely surprised by his words, but he only looked menacingly at his wife and declared that today was the promised day. Rafilia was taken aback by such a statement, but in turn did not say anything to him. After some time, she was waiting for her husband in his room. In turn, the young lady felt relieved as she knew that everything would be fine with the night. Earlier, she went to see him and declared with doctor's joy that the temperature had subsided and he could observe him. Rafilia was glad that the herbs worked quickly. It seems that the way she made him drink was the most effective. After a moment, the young lady came to her senses as she heard that her husband had come into the room. At the same time, she was a little surprised by his appearance. Silas, in turn, slowly approached his wife and quietly sat down on the bed. She looked at her husband with a smile and said that she had gone to the night on the way to the room, and after she found out that his temperature had dropped, she felt relief. After a moment, an awkward atmosphere reigned between them. The prince restrained his rage, but after a few moments, he asked his wife if something had happened when they went to the forest to collect herbs. The young lady was surprised by such a question, but she declared that a monster appeared and Owen saved her. She also said with a smile that for the first time she saw his fiery ability, and it was truly excellent. At the same moment, the prince wondered if she really asked for the key to the greenhouse because she loved plants. She looked at him with bewilderment and declared that it was so, but did not understand why he was asking about such a thing. Silas, I wondered if she had done something similar for a date. At the same moment, she sneezed and, unfortunately, did not hear the question. At the same time, the young lady asked him to repeat the question. The prince did not repeat the question and asked her to forget about him. At the same moment, he looked intently and embarrassedly at his wife, and a moment later he tenderly touched her face. But at the same moment she looked away and noticed his anklet. She remembered how Lady Grace, with a bright smile, said that the ring was similar, but she and the prince were strong, and therefore she could understand his state of health. Silas reached out to his wife, intending to kiss her, but she pulled away. Silas looked at his wife in bewilderment, as he did not understand her reaction. At the same moment, he wondered why she avoided him. At the same moment, the young lady timidly declared that she thought the kiss should be reserved for the one whom he really loved. Silas, in turn, froze in place from shock as he was stunned by her words. At the same moment, he remembered his wife, who looked tenderly at his friend. And at the same time, he did not know if there was something more between them. At the same moment, he angrily declared that he believed her words to be true. She condemned such actions and immediately recalled the past. She knew that she had experienced a lot of pain because of her husband, but she knew that young people cherished each other very much and loved each other, and therefore they reached the very end together. But after a moment, all her thoughts flew away, as the prince threw her on the bed. She looked in bewilderment at her husband, who was undressing in front of her. Silas declared with icy calmness that even without love, a married couple was still a married couple. The young lady froze in a stupor, because she did not expect such a thing. At the same moment, she declared that this would only create a feeling of emptiness. At the same moment, he approached her and declared that she should fulfill her duties as his wife. Rafilia was confused and lost, but at the same time she understood that she could not avoid such a thing, but it was very painful for her because of the way he treated her. The next morning, the young lady woke up, but at the same time she noticed that her husband was not in bed. She wondered if he had simply gone out somewhere or had gone to do his work. At the same time, she felt devastated. After a moment, she remembered their night. Then the prince sighed heavily and said that he was very sorry. She wondered if he was really sorry that he touched her. After a moment, all her thoughts flew away as she remembered the night. She wanted to know how he was doing now. Without wasting a minute, she went to the young man, who met her with a smile and words of gratitude, because thanks to her, he was cured. Rafilia said, with a smile, that she was very glad that he had recovered, but she also said that he should rest for a few days. Owen said that the prince was visiting him, and at the same time, he forgot the handkerchief. Owen asked the lady if she could give him the handkerchief, After some time, the young lady hurried to her husband, as she was glad that the prince's knight had not died. At the same time, the young lady slowly approached her husband's room. But after a moment she froze, as she heard that he was talking to someone. Looking closely, she saw young Lady Grace. At the same moment, she hid behind the door. At the same moment, she was startled, because she heard that the prince was going to get away from her. Grace sighed heavily and declared that she agreed with him, and it would be better if they parted. At the same moment, the prince realized that their marriage was a mistake, but the lady asked him not to worry, as she intended to stay with him. Rafilia was puzzled, as she understood that she should have known about their relationship. She knew that he did not love her from the very beginning, but at the same time, he demanded the fulfillment of conjugal duties. Letty stared intently at the young man and said that she would be by his side until the very end. Rafilia sighed heavily, as she was in unbearable pain because of this. At the same time, she wondered why she felt so unhappy. After some time, the young lady asked her maid to give the handkerchief to the prince. But Lydia, in turn, asked the lady what had happened. Rafilia Ulubkoi looked at the maid and said that nothing like that had happened and it was all right. A moment later, a maid entered their room. Lydia looked at the mistress in surprise, as she had received a letter from the queen. Rafilia looked at the maid in surprise, as she did not expect to receive such a letter. At the same time, she wondered what it could mean. She stated that the queen wanted them to attend the anniversary celebration of the orphanage instead of her. The date and time were specified in the invitation. The young lady sighed heavily, as she understood that this was all for a reason. Lydia said that the queen wanted to avoid leaving the house because of the epidemic, so she had a message that must be kept secret from the castle staff and the prince. Rafilia was taken aback for a moment as she remembered the orphanage, as she remembered that the queen was involved in the incident. She remembered how in her past life, on her way to the orphanage, bandits were waiting for her on the road. She knew that this was the same incident with the abduction. She was then asked to replace the queen. At the same time, the young lady wondered if this meant that the queen was still behind the scenes. She assumed that the queen had been waiting for an opportunity to wipe her off the face of the earth since they got married. The maid looked intently at her mistress and said that these events would take place in 1 week. Letty was surprised, as everything seemed very strange to her. After all, a similar abduction happened only 6 months later. She wondered if everything had changed because she had started to change reality. Rafilia perfectly understood that she needed to prepare for leaving the castle in a week. She wanted to make her plan a reality. At the same time, she understood that she needed to deal with her husband as soon as possible and divorce him. She wanted her husband and Lady Grace to live in happiness and harmony. After everything she had heard, she understood that now was the perfect time to part with the prince. After some time, the young girl went out into the garden as she had an appointment. She looked into the distance with a smile as she saw her relatives. Rafilia looked at her sister puzzled since they had the same faces, and she could at least disguise herself. Selena stated that they had different hairstyles, so there was no reason to panic. The young man looked at his sister with a smile and said that now that she has become a member of the royal family, they need to be careful. Rafilia sighed and declared that they don't need to say her name out loud, because they have a secret sortie. But in turn, the young lady was very happy to see her relatives after a long separation. After a moment, they moved to a small cafe. At the same time, Lady S looked at her relatives with a smile. They played together since childhood, and 6 months before her wedding, they became husband and wife. Now they managed a ranch together in the southern countryside, and once she went to visit them. Rafilia asked her sister's forgiveness for the fact that she had to travel a long way to the capital, but Selena only smiled and said that she wanted to see her sister. Selena looked closely at her sister and excitedly asked what had happened. She was worried that her sister's family life might not be going well. The young lady, in turn, did not answer anything, and after a moment, she said that she needed their help in this matter. After a moment, Selena screamed in surprise and asked her sister if she really wanted to do something like that. Oliver closed his wife's mouth at the same moment, as he did not want her to scream and raise a fuss. Rafilia stated that for this reason, she wanted them to hide her until the period with her disappeared long ago due to their marriage. After all, she intended to open a pharmacy and live independently. Oliver said that he understood her, and since they had the same faces, even if they were found, they would be able to hide it. Rafilia sighed heavily and said that for this reason they should not see each other. She understood that it would be burdensome for her sister. Selena said that they are not against helping her, but she wanted to know why her sister acted in such a way. The young man said with a smile that she had her own reasons, and looking at his wife, he said that since her sister had decided to do something similar, they should not interfere. Rafilia looked at her relatives with a smile and thanked them for such a thing. At the same time, she declared that she would not inconvenience them. Selena asked her sister how she plans to explain this to her parents. Rafilia declared that she would allow her father and the others to believe that she had been kidnapped. After a moment, she said that when a few years pass and the divorce is finalized, she intends to show herself properly. Lady asked her sister when she was planning to carry out the escape plan. Rafilia said in a calm manner that she would run away in 3 days. Young people were shocked because everything happened very quickly. After some time, the young lady sorted the tea. She assumed that the effect would increase if she continued to drink it further. She wondered if the prince would continue to drink it properly, even after her death. At the same moment, she thought about all the good things that happened between them. But at the same moment, she remembered how he took her by force. At the same time, she was upset by memories and unconsciously scattered things. Lydia said with a smile that everything was fine and she would clean it up quickly. Rafilia looked intently at the maid and said that she had a small request. She asked the maid if she could make tea for the prince at least once a week. Lydia said that she was not against it, but she knew that the prince was happier when Rafilia made him tea. Lydia said that Anna would do something similar, but if something happened to her, she would like Lydia to do it instead of her. The maid was startled and declared that her mistress should not say such things. Rafilia perfectly understood that she had done everything she could, and therefore she could leave with a clean soul. Then she remembered how he said that he was cursed, and at the same time, she thought that it would be nice to dream of his curse. But she remembered the words of the old man, who said that perhaps there were other necessary conditions, besides reaching the age of majority, and he said that similar information could be found in old literature. At the same moment, the young lady asked the maid if there was a place in the castle similar to an archive where there were various documents. Lydia said that a similar place was in the basement, but not many people in the castle had the keys. At the same moment, the lady guessed who could have the keys. At the same moment, the maid declared that the captain of the knights also had the keys. A moment later, Owen entered their room, and with a joyful smile announced that he had brought fruit for his benefactor, who had taken care of him the other day. At the same moment, the young ladies looked intently at the captain. Rafilia looked at the captain in surprise, but at the same moment said that he had come just in time. The knight looked at her in bewilderment, as he did not understand what she was talking about. After some time, they went to the archive. The knight said that he was extremely surprised when he learned that the lady wanted to go to the archive, because even he rarely went to such a place. She sighed heavily and said that she was sorry that she had to worry him, but she had to check something. A moment later, they entered the archive and saw the dusty shelves. Owen sighed heavily as he saw that the archive was still full of junk. The lady sighed heavily and looked around intently, as she understood that it would not be very difficult to find literature related to the curse. Without wasting a minute, Rafilia plunged into the search for suitable literature. The young man looked at the lady in surprise and wondered if she was really trying to unravel the secret of the prince's curse. At the same moment, she declared that it was so. He smiled and declared that he had assumed the same. He knew this because he also tried to do something similar. The young lady looked at him in surprise, as she did not expect to hear something like that at all. But at the same moment, she saw that he reached for some book. At the same moment, he handed her the book and said that she would help her. He said that there were ancient records in the book. She was surprised and did not know how he found out about such a thing. He said with a smile that he had already looked through these books. You are a repository. Together with the prince, he was looking for some tips and ways, because they wanted to dream of a curse. Rafilia looked at the young man with a gentle smile, as she understood that the prince was sincerely glad that he had such a friend. Rafilia looked closely at the young man, as she was glad that he still did not die. At the same moment, he looked intently at her and declared that, watching her, he could tell with truth that she loved the prince very much. She looked at him in surprise, as she did not expect to hear such a thing. Owen said with a smile that the girl wants to make the prince happy, and the search for a way to lift the curse from him testifies to their great love. At the same moment, he said with a smile that she should look after her husband. After a moment, she immersed herself in reading and read that the one who wore the purple mark must have great power in his body, but he was born with a curse. After the curse is lifted, they will bring peace, fertility, and prosperity to the earth, and many years of peace. In 1 hour, a child with a purple mark was born, as it was predicted. As expected, it was difficult to control the power, so the king imprisoned him and began to wait for the right moment. When he reached adulthood, the curse disappeared and all power passed to him. After a man became a king, he ruled the country very wisely and brought various riches to the nation. But later, he followed the path of continuous prosperity. The young lady understood that according to the records, the life of the king should have been recorded by era. But after a moment, she saw that one page was missing from the book. She remembered how Alfred had told her that part of the literature was missing. Owen stared at the book and said that someone had deliberately torn out the letter. At the same moment, they both looked at each other as they assumed that someone deliberately wanted the curse not to be lifted. She didn't want to think about it, but unfortunately, she couldn't help suspecting the queen or the prince, because the inability to control one's abilities should be an obstacle to the royal succession. She understood that it was convenient for them that the curse remained. Owen looked at his companion with a smile and said that perhaps she was thinking the same thing as he was. She wondered in amazement what he was talking about. He said with a smile that it was already night, and it was time for them to finish. After all, she still did not know how to dream of a curse. And to her chagrin, she saw her husband, who was imprisoned and cut off from the world. He lost his mother and was still subjected to mockery in order to please the king. She perfectly understood that he would continue to suffer from the curse even after she left the castle. At the same moment, the young lady looked intently at her companion and called him. She came closer to him and, taking his hand, said that she would like to talk with him about a relative way to lift the curse from the prince. She asked if he could never give up on him. He looked at the lady with gentle embarrassment and declared that he agreed, and she also should not refuse. But at the same moment, the prince approached them and angrily inquired why they were together in such a place. The young people were startled and looked at the prince with surprise, who was looking at them with fury as he saw that they were holding hands. Owen was surprised and released the lady, saying that it was a misunderstanding. The princess angrily looked at the young people and declared that his wife should not have permission to enter this room. Rafilia, in the same minute, declared that she asked the captain to accompany her, and he did nothing wrong. The prince told his friend that he must leave immediately. The young man was frightened and asked for forgiveness for letting the lady into the room without permission. He wanted to protect the lady, but at the same moment, the prince looked at him menacingly and said that he wanted to talk to her, so he had to leave. The young man understood that he would not be of any help to the lady in this situation, so he left them. Rafilia looked intently at the prince, as she had seen him for the first time since their last night. The prince looked angrily at his wife and said that earlier she had said that as long as they were not in public, they would do what they wanted. She sighed heavily as she remembered her own words. At the same moment, she declared that her words were just a figure of speech, and he understood everything wrongly. At the same minute, he said that during the day, he had received a message that she was walking around the city with a man. Lady was surprised when she realized that his spies had seen her sister with her husband. He looked at her intently and said that he would be grateful if she would refrain from doing such things in public. She understood that if she spoke about her relatives, he would suspect something after her disappearance, so she could not explain the reason for the meeting, and she understood that she had to speak very carefully. The prince was surprised, as she did not even come up with an excuse. The young lady didn't care what he thought of her, since they would never see each other again. At the same moment, she sighed heavily and said that she would be careful from now on. The young man became furious when he heard her words. At the same moment, he furiously pressed her against the wall. Silas looked at her and said that even if she didn't do anything behind his back, he still remained her husband, and he would be very grateful if she remembered that. She looked at him with a smile and said that she was perfectly aware of this, and, after all, he was the only man she adored. Silas glared at her and declared that she could say anything with her beautiful mouth, but at the same time, he wondered if she didn't think there was a contradiction between her actions and her words. The lady said with a smile that the same applies to him, because earlier he said that their marriage was fictitious. Silas asked furiously if she had specifically asked to anger him. Rafilia asked for forgiveness with a smile, and since she hurt him with her words, she said that she sincerely regrets it. He looked at her in surprise and wondered why she couldn't control herself. She smiled and said in a calm manner that people and life are not something that can be controlled. She also knew that everything was right, because her previous life did not go according to plan. At the same moment, the prince could not resist and tightly hugged his wife, while she knew that this time she would make the right choice. The young lady stood stunned for some time, as she did not understand him. At the same moment, he sighed heavily and declared that he had never met a woman like her before. She sighed heavily, as she understood that this was all unfair. She remembered his cruel words when he insisted that their lack was a mistake. She did not understand how he dared, after all that was said, to simply embrace her with tenderness and warmth. Rafilia, in turn, understood that in a few days she would be freed and turn her plan into reality and disappear. She understood that she simply had no choice, because if she wanted to live a happy life, she should just leave. The prince looked at his wife in surprise and asked if she was crying. She sighed and said that it was not so. Rafilia wanted him to stop touching her, while the prince tenderly kissed her eyes, wiping away her tears. Rafilia was devastated and didn't understand why she still couldn't forget their night. She remembered how he had touched her tenderly that night, despite her words. Rafilia listened to his sweet voice, but she also understood that she could have misinterpreted all his actions towards her. She did not want his closeness, and therefore at the same moment she pushed him away. At the same moment, she looked intently at him and asked the prince not to plunge her into even greater confusion. At the same moment, the prince declared with a satisfied smile that he had already dragged her into confusion. At the same moment, he pulled her closer and kissed her. After a short kiss, he looked at her sadly and wondered if she really hated it so much. When he looked at her, he asked for forgiveness, because he forced her to endure a loveless kiss. She could not stand it, and at the same moment furiously slapped him in the face. He froze for a moment and looked at her menacingly. At the same moment, the young lady realized what she had done. After a moment, she rushed to the exit, but the prince quietly said that she should stop. At the same moment, she turned and looked at him. The young lady looked worriedly at her husband, as she saw that his condition was changing. In the same moment, he reached for her, but at the same moment, he felt a burning pain that spread throughout his body. The young lady was startled and immediately rushed to him, but she did not have time to run to her husband when she suddenly saw Lady Grace. Lady quickly rushed to the prince and began to calm him down. After a moment, she used her ability on the prince, as it was intended to stabilize his condition. At the same moment, the lady announced that she and the prince were going to the tower. Rafilia looked at them with a smile, as she was glad that her husband was under the reliable care of the lady. Lady Grace looked at her with a smile and said that she did not need to worry, and that the prince would be in good hands. Leaving his last strength, the prince said that when he returned, they would definitely talk. Rafilia, in turn, sighed heavily, as she knew that she did not need to hesitate. Bursting with bitter tears, she understood that she had to proceed with the implementation of her plan, since she wanted to live as she had dreamed before.